In Search of British Heroes, written and read by Tony Robinson. This is a quest, a search for 5 British heroes, in the course of which I've managed to unite 2 separate interests of mine. First, there's the idea of heroes, and the stories we tell about them to explain who we are. Since I was a kid, I've been fascinated and inspired by those men and women who seem to live on another plane, doing great deeds that I could only aspire to. Odysseus, Biggles, Churchill, and once I entered my teens, James Dean and Che Guevara, offered me the possibility of inhabiting a world in which I could be stronger, braver, more clever than I could ever be in the security of my semi-detached home in suburban London, where I earnestly tried to live out my fantasies. Even as adults, how could we fail to be moved by the epic achievements of Ellen MacArthur sailing round the world, or Nelson Mandela realising his dream of a free South Africa? But Mandela is very real to us, while Odysseus isn't. The further we get from a hero, the more that person's smothered by the weight of legend that accrues around them. I wanted to look at some of the storybook heroes of my early life to see what I could learn about them as an adult. I settled for 5 British heroes who not only fascinated me as characters, but whose stories seem to form part of the fabric of our nation's culture. Boudica, who I'd grown up with as Boudicca, King Harold, Macbeth, William Wallace, and finally the ultimate boyhood hero, Robin Hood. And the search for them brought into play my second interest, the British landscape. 10 years working with archaeologists have taught me how redolent with human activity every square inch of our island is. Each hillside has been terraced and re-terraced for 2,000 years or more. Every valley bears the marks of settlements long since swept away by war, disease, and the caprice of nature. Our neighbourhood Boots the chemist was doubtless built over the foundations of an apothecary, our local body shop over a medieval tanner's yard. So I set out to try and find traces of my heroes in our landscape. But could I with some degree of certainty trace the site of Macbeth's death or Boudica's last stand? After wrestling with contradictory academic tomes and tramping around old forgotten corners of Britain from pigsties to municipal car parks, I'm pleased to say the answer is a qualified yes. I'd be a fool to claim absolute certainty, but what I can offer is, as near as damn it, the real story of my 5 heroes. Our first destination is East Anglia. Boudica. When names I've known for decades suddenly change, it drives me mad. I can understand why the people of Sri Lanka and Zimbabwe wanted to reject the colonial name tags Ceylon and Rhodesia, but it didn't help my O-level geography. Marathon bars became Snickers, Jif transformed into the hideous-sounding Sif, and I became intensely irritated. But sometimes there's a valid justification behind a name change, and this chapter is a case in point. Who's the queen who stood up to the Romans, scything through the mighty legions in her famous chariot with its grisly hubcaps? We've all known the answer since childhood. It's Boudicca. Well, I'm sorry, but it isn't any more. Boudicca is just an imperial conceit, which we'll consign to the rubbish bin. Boudica is derived from the Celtic word for victory. She was our first Queen Victoria. The Victorians were only too aware of the parallels, and it's they who brought the early British Queen back to prominence. In doing so, they not only got her name wrong, they also ensured that the facts of her life were covered by a double layer of mythology. The first layer was applied by the Romans. The great Roman writer Tacitus gave us the 2 earliest accounts of Boudica's life in his Annals and in the biographical history of his father-in-law Agricola. Agricola was in Britain during the Boudican revolt, serving as a junior officer, so Tacitus had access to an eyewitness. Tacitus was Roman to the core. To him, Boudica and the ancient Britons were simply barbarians, the Roman catch-all term for bearded foreigners who behaved in strange and un-Roman ways, such as letting a woman be the boss. His account is coloured by his belief that, for all their faults, the Romans were heroes, the Roman Empire was generally a good thing, and what the barbarians needed more than anything else was its civilising influence. The other classical Roman source is Dio Cassius. His account comes to us in the form of edited highlights copied out by an 11th century monk. Together, Dio Cassius and Tacitus forged the myth of the avenging wild woman. But much later, this Roman myth was taken up and twisted by the Victorians to give us the great British heroine, epitomised by Thomas Thornycroft's famous statue erected in the shadow of the Houses of Parliament. The plinth calls her Boudicca. She stands high above the milling throng of tourists, with her daughters at her feet, in her chariot with its famous bladed wheels. She's dressed in the classical garb of a Roman empress rather than the plaids of a first-century Briton. Without reins, she controls 2 rearing stallions, modelled on horses from Queen Victoria's own stables. The inscription reads, "Regions Caesar never knew, thy posterity shall sway." She's a patriotic symbol of the Queen of England, spreading the influence of the British Empire further than the Romans could ever have imagined. She was a key element in the formulation of the figure of Britannia, who used to appear on old 1-penny pieces. It's an absurdly inappropriate metaphor, because Boudica was anti-empire. She was more like the kind of third-world tribal leader who'd have organised a rebellion against the sway of Victoria and Britain. And while we're unpicking the myths of Boudica, we may as well start with her most famous trademarks. The one thing we can say with absolute certainty is that she didn't have blades on the wheels of her chariot. Celtic chariots were lightweight affairs, made of wood, leather and wicker, intended as speedy battle taxis getting warriors to the front line, then veering away as quickly as possible. The British lines were so packed that knives on her chariot would have chewed up more of her own side than the enemy. And pulling these nippy wicker carts weren't great thoroughbred horses, but small hardy ponies, similar to the ones you still find roaming Dartmoor. We know this because of the work archaeologists have done, and their excavations provide us with another major source for corroborative detail about our heroine. Our first stop on the Boudica Trail is a Nissan garage on the Fyson Way industrial estate in the outskirts of Thetford. Beneath the rows of cars was once a vast temple complex. Archaeologists have pieced together what it would have looked like. The temple was enormous. The whole area covered 32,000 square metres. Like a series of Russian dolls, there were 2 ditches and ramparts, and no fewer than 9 parallel fences leading to a central enclosure. Some archaeologists claim that finds of brooches here may have meant it was a meeting place thronged with people who were too tightly packed to notice the loss of jewellery. I think a more convincing argument for this being Boudica's rallying point is a common-sense one. Politics and religion were so intertwined in the Celtic world that this massive temple complex in Boudica's homeland would have been the natural place for the rebelling tribes to assemble. Thetford was right at the heart of Iceni territory. Boudica's temple complex is to the northeast of the town centre. Turn left at the Nissan garage, onto Howlett Way, and the first left is the telltale Hill Fort Close, which mimics the eastern entrance to the temple. If you walk down this little cul-de-sac, you'll be treading roughly the same ground as 100,000 tribespeople did nearly 2,000 years ago as they answered Boudica's summons. Here they squeezed into the open space of the mysterious arena to witness the Iceni queen launch her famous campaign against the Roman occupying forces. Dio Cassius gives us the only description we have of her. He says her appearance was terrifying. She was very tall and carried a spear. She had a mass of tawny hair, and her voice was harsh and rasping. She wore a cloak fastened with a brooch to a multi-hued tunic, probably plaid like modern Scottish tartan. She also wore a gold neck ring known as a torque. These chunky pieces of jewellery still turn up on archaeological digs. They were immensely heavy, and it seems likely that they were worn only on ceremonial occasions. The immediate cause of her insurrection was personal. She'd been robbed of her inheritance by the Romans. Their colonial forces had further humiliated her and her tribe by publicly beating her and raping her daughters. Such an insult was enough to justify reprisals by the Iceni. But among the multitudes gathered in Thetford were representatives of other tribes, notably the Trinovantes. Their presence shows there was more at stake than reprisal for the terrible acts perpetrated on the tribal chief of the Iceni. To understand the Boudican revolt of AD 60-61, we have to look at how our island came under the thumb of foreign occupation. Iron Age Britain was a thickly populated island, but her people wouldn't have seen themselves as British. The country was divided into more than 20 tribal groupings. There were the Caledoni in Scotland, the great tribe of the Brigantes in what's now the north of England. In the Midlands there were the Catevallauni. In Essex and South Suffolk the Trinovantes, while the Iceni occupied most of East Anglia. These tribes shared a common Celtic culture and the religion of Druidism. But they were also riven by border disputes, and whenever the Romans came up against them, they played on these tribal divisions. The first time the British Celts felt the force of the Mediterranean superpower on their soil was 100 years before Boudica's time, when Julius Caesar arrived in 55 BC. He'd already conquered Gaul, but he made a hash of his first British campaign and retreated back to the continent without crossing the Thames. The next year, 54 BC, he returned. Nobody humiliated Julius Caesar and got away with it. Significantly, he was invited in by the Trinovantes, who wanted his protection against a rival tribe. He moved through southern Britain and received the submission of several tribes, then he left again. Britain was a useful source of tin, and the oysters from the east coast were excellent, but otherwise it was uninviting. The next potential invader was the psychotic despot Caligula. But the decisive military campaign was carried out by Caligula's successor, Claudius. The Emperor Claudius had good reason for wanting to extend the bounds of the empire. He needed some good PR. Nowadays, he's thought to have been a good administrator, but in his day, he wasn't considered emperor material. Claudius was the sort of boy who gets teased at school. He limped, had some sort of disability in his right hand, and slobbered when he was angry. Within a year of becoming emperor, he had to deal with an attempted coup. So Claudius resurrected the idea of adding Britain to the imperial collection. The Roman army invaded in AD 43. The pretext, as before, was internecine strife between British tribal factions. The Roman commander, Aulus Plautius, fought his way through southern Britain. Then, with most of the fighting done, it was time for Claudius to join the fun of the triumphal parade. Through the settlement of Camulodunum, he paraded with his forces. In front of the natives who fought in plaid and woad, he marched his heavy infantry with their body armour and shields and crested helmets. Then there were the cavalry and Claudius's exotic shock troops, a detachment of elephants. They must have seemed like extraterrestrials to a population who thought the largest thing alive was an ox. Claudius declared Camulodunum the capital of his newly conquered country. It was the first real city in Britain, today's Colchester, and was laid out in true Roman fashion with straight streets, shops, and urban facilities. Later, it acquired the official status of a colonia, a place where Roman legionaries could retire after their 16-year period of service. This was a tried and tested way of bringing conquered peoples into the fold of the Pax Romana. The existing town centre is laid out several metres above the Roman settlement, the high street shops reflecting the layout of their ancient equivalents. If you walk up the high street, you'll see the Roman passion for straight lines opening out in front of you. The shops that once occupied the same land as the Lion Walk shopping centre would have stocked wine, olive oil, dates and figs, herbs and spices like dill, anise and coriander, and other Mediterranean luxuries. Archaeologists have even discovered opium poppies, adding a whole new dimension to the idea of adopting Roman habits. It's probably fair to say you could have brought more exotic goods in Colchester in AD 50 than in AD 1950. And what did Boudica do about the Roman military occupation and the flagrant cultural imperialism of the new regime? Nothing. She may well not have witnessed Claudius's elephant parade. She wasn't tribal chief when he arrived, and a ruler called Atedius offered the submission of the Iceni. But there's no doubt she would have heard about the amazing procession. To fund its policy of Romanisation, the superpower offered generous sums of money to its new colonial friends. These came both from public sources and individuals. The Roman philosopher Seneca personally invested a small fortune in Britain. Had the British tribes been more financially astute, they would have realised that these lifestyle aid payments weren't made because Seneca and the Romans were nice people. They wanted something in return. But gift-giving was a key part of the Celts' culture. Being generous enhanced the status of the giver. It would have seemed natural for a faraway emperor to distribute his largesse. But the speculator's money was a slow-burning fuse that would eventually contribute to Boudica's uprising. That, though, was still in the future. For now, instant gold and silver seemed too good to refuse. From evidence on silver coins, we know that sometime after the Romans arrived, King Prasutagus took over as king of the Iceni. His coinage bears the traditional horse design of the Iceni, with the abbreviated form of the tribal name ECE, standing for Iceni. Prasutagus's wife was Boudica. It's only an assumption that she was born an Iceni. She may have been a princess from one of the other tribes, possibly the Trinovantes, who were so quick to support her rebellion. The Iceni were principally horse traders. Their East Anglian homeland was boggy and difficult to farm. Today, it's where the army exercises its six-wheel drive amphibious vehicles. Boudica and Prasutagus probably lived in a modest villa, where they drank imported wine and ate the fruits of a warmer climate. Their people inhabited thatched roundhouses, drank home-brewed beer, and ate grain and root vegetables. The Iceni were great metalworkers, making jewellery like the torques worn by Boudica, ornamental gear for chariots and horses, and, of course, weapons. Like all other Celtic tribes, they were a warrior culture. Which leads us to the first signs of unrest against the Roman administration. Not all the British tribes had capitulated as easily as the Trinovantes and the Iceni. There was a stern rearguard action being led by tribes further to the north and east. The Silures in Wales were particularly violent in their opposition, as were the Druids, who it seems were helping to orchestrate the British campaign. Their headquarters was at Ynys Môn, the sacred Isle of Anglesey. The Romans drew their first line of defence from the Humber estuary southwest to Exeter along the Fosse Way. But in spite of the soft words and promises, the Romans didn't completely trust the tribes on the peaceful side of the border. In AD 47, the Roman governor made the fateful decision to disarm the friendly tribes. Robbing a warrior of his weapons was a terrible disgrace. The Iceni rose in revolt. It didn't last long. Historians tell of a brief fight against the Romans, who trapped them in a fort defended by earthworks. This rudimentary castle was no match for the seasoned centurions, who marched in and destroyed the rebels. There's no record of any more unrest for the next 12 years. Prasutagus and Boudica must have put up with a good deal in order to preserve the peace in East Anglia. but the event that was to transform their lives happened 2,000 miles away in Rome. In AD 54, Claudius was poisoned by his fourth wife, so that her son could become emperor instead, the 16-year-old Lucius Domitius Enobarbus, or as we know him, Nero. The old administration in Britain was replaced by a new and harsher regime. Nowhere were its effects more deeply felt than in Colchester. The Roman army behaved like any occupying force in alien territory. It maintained discipline by employing a background level of brutality. Colchester Museum displays graphic evidence of the sort of maltreatment that must have been commonplace. There you can see the skulls of ancient Britons executed by soldiers, which were then stuck on poles to encourage better behaviour in the rest of the population. Roman Colchester was full of ex-army veterans. 3,000 of these set up shop around Colchester, driving natives from their land and then treating the former owners as captives and slaves. The current generation of soldiers turned a blind eye. They too would one day be looking for a nice little place in the country. Like colonialists everywhere, the Romans were so pleased with their progress that they didn't notice the growing resentment of the people they'd conquered. It was decided that the Roman headquarters should have a brand new temple, dedicated to the stuttering Claudius, now declared divine by the people who'd had him assassinated. The temple was built on a scale unimaginable to tribes used to single-storey thatched dwellings. It was 20 metres high and made of stone with a tiled roof. There was an inner room known as a cellar, reached through a pair of bronze doors. Outside this was a colonnade composed of pillars a metre thick. At the bottom of a flight of steps at the front was an entrance area with a series of statues. Inside there was intended to be a giant statue of the now deified Claudius. Not only was it on a scale never seen before in Britain, but it also underlined the alien nature of Roman religious practice. Druidism was essentially a nature religion, and most rites took place in sacred groves, not in a massive building in the middle of a city. What was worse, the Trinovantes were used as slave labour to build it, and they were taxed to pay for it. No wonder even the Roman writer Tacitus called it a blatant stronghold of alien rule. Amazingly, part of it still exists. If you take a guided tour of Colchester Museum, you can see the remains under the ruins of the Norman castle. It was the Trinovantes who had to bear the burden of the new temple of Claudius, but around AD 60, the Roman administration introduced a swingeing new policy that impacted on all the client kingdoms. Perhaps word had got round that there was trouble brewing. Whatever the reason, the investors in Rome decided they wanted their money back. The debt collection would involve force if necessary. But the spark that ignited the powder keg was an abuse of power directed specifically at the Iceni. In AD 60, Prasutagus died, leaving his wife Boudica as ruler. The Romans, of course, thought this was barbarous, and saw their opportunity to make the most of what seemed to them a weak and feeble leader. Prasutagus was a natural appeaser, and in an attempt to protect his wife and children, he left half his property to the emperor. But this wasn't enough for the procurator of Britain, Catus Decianus. He confiscated all the dead king's property. The chiefs of the Iceni were also deprived of their hereditary estates, and the king's relatives were treated like slaves. Then, in a symbolic act of domination and cruelty, Boudica was taken to a public place and flogged. Her daughters were raped, not the random act of conquering forces, but the sort of deliberate sexual humiliation perpetrated in recent ethnic conflicts. Boudica and her daughters represented the Iceni, and the Romans wanted to demonstrate who was boss. In her turn, Boudica knew that her humiliation represented the subjugation of the entire tribe. Vengeance was due for all the wrongs done to the Iceni. Boudica went to war. Dio Cassius records her making a lengthy rhetorical speech here, but there's no reason to think this is factual. He also records, though, that she prayed to the goddess Andraste for victory, and released a hare into the multitude to determine by the direction in which it ran whether the campaign would be a success. The hare was a sacred creature, one of the few native mammals in Britain, unlike the rabbit, which was introduced by the Romans. This ritual action attributed to Boudica seems highly plausible. After receiving a favourable omen, her horde set off south towards Colchester, burning and looting Roman farms as they went. Her army was totally different from the Roman forces, which were divided into centuries and legions, each highly organised. This was a whole people on the move. Along with the warriors, there would have been womenfolk and children, carts carrying granny and household supplies, with enough space for the anticipated booty of war. The column of over 100,000 people was a slow-moving juggernaut, gathering supporters as it went. The moment of revenge had come for years of oppression. There would have been anticipation, excitement, and a sense of release. The Roman military governor was Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, known simply as Suetonius. He'd taken the bulk of the active Roman forces on a campaign against the Druid stronghold of Anglesey, about as far away from East Anglia as they could get. Whether by chance or clever intention, there were few troops available to oppose the advance of the Iceni. Then a succession of frightening portents struck terror into the superstitious Romans. A holy effigy toppled from its perch and fell face downwards. It was probably a statue of the Roman version of the Greek goddess Nike, who in those days epitomised not credible sportswear, but victory. Then unexplained shrieks were heard in the theatre and the Senate House. A ghostly ruined town was seen in the Thames. The sea turned blood red, and shapes like corpses appeared on the seashore at ebb tide. The inhabitants of Colchester panicked. Archaeology has found the old and rusty weapons hastily brought out of storage by retired veterans who realised they had one more rearguard action to fight. But they were vastly outnumbered. Colchester was wide open. Then Boudica attacked. The wooden structures of the shops and dwellings burnt easily and were impossible to defend. The Roman veterans retreated to the only stone building in town, the recently completed Temple of Claudius. Archaeologists have calculated that the cellar might have held as many as 1,000 frightened Romans, not just the toughened soldiers, but women and children too. They held out for 2 days. The stone building would have been hard to burn down, and with the bronze doors bolted, the only way to get at the occupants would have been to climb 20 metres and dismantle the tile roof. The terrified refugees inside would have been in total blackness. Choking on the stench of sweat, faeces and fear, they could only wait, listening to the sounds of their city being consumed, their friends and relatives screaming. Then the smaller noises, the scraping and banging of patient hatred working its way into the roof. The first chinks of light as tiles came loose. The hungry barbarian faces peering down into the gloom, wiping out any hope of escape. The destruction of Colchester was total. Boudica has left her testament written plain for today's archaeologists. The debris left from the rubble of the city is known as the Boudican destruction layer. It's bright red. When the daub from timber-framed houses is burnt, it usually reverts to the clay from which it came, but the firestorm of Boudica's attack was so fierce that it cooked the daub in the same way that pottery is fired in a kiln. From the comparative thicknesses of this red layer, archaeologists can tell which way buildings crashed to the ground and where there were open areas such as gardens. In spite of its terrible origins, it's also a superb tool for dating. Everything found beneath it is from before AD 60. Everything above is later. Of course, this layer's now been covered by the detritus of 2 millennia. Boudica's Colchester lies metres below the modern-day city. But in a basement storeroom at the George Hotel in Colchester High Street, there's a window into the wall which frames the red layer at eye level. It's clearly visible, about 15 centimetres thick. But the Boudican layer isn't the only surviving evidence of the intensity of the inferno. We also have a record of some surprising and, in the circumstances, touching details of the daily lives of the citizens of the Colonia. Carbonised seeds have been found in 7 locations in Roman Colchester. Some in Culver Street have been mixed with barley and had started to sprout, a sign that they'd been treated to make beer. There are pieces of mattress with the patterns still imprinted on them, and red Samian pottery from Gaul. So hot was the blaze that it fired the red slip to black. You can see many of these finds at Colchester Museum. But there are other objects there too that bear testament to the anger of Boudica's avenging Britons. At the museum are 2 defaced gravestones. One is from the grave of a Roman centurion called Facilis, whose carved nose and face had been brutally smashed in. The other is of a soldier from the 1st Thracian Cavalry Regiment. He chose to be depicted in death on horseback, trampling a cowering figure. To the marauding Britons, this looked like a gleeful statement of imperialism, so they hacked off the face and threw the gravestone carved side down. It lay there until it was discovered nearly 2,000 years later. Incredibly, further excavation also found the fragment of face some way off, and it fits perfectly. This was no casual act of mutilation. Faces and heads had enormous significance to the Britons. This is demonstrated in a further fascinating discovery. Early last century, a boy went swimming in the River Ald near Saxmundham in Suffolk. To his surprise, he found a bronze head on the riverbed. He took it home, whitewashed it, and stuck it outside his cottage like a garden gnome. By chance, it was seen by someone who recognised its importance. Eventually it found its way to the British Museum, which paid 5 shillings for it. It was from a huge statue of Claudius. There are jagged edges round the neck where Boudica and the Iceni hacked off the symbolic head of their enemy. At one time it was thought it might be from the giant statue of Claudius which stood in the temple. But the way the head tilts up suggests that this Claudius was mounted on horseback, leaning back in the stirrups to control his steed, and would have been from a statue elsewhere in the city. The decapitation of this image had symbolic meaning because the ancient Celts were headhunters. Heads were an offering to the gods of war. Warriors would tie the heads of victims to their horses and take them home where they were highly prized. They were embalmed in cedar oil or cleaned out and used as drinking vessels. Druid religion also placed great emphasis on the sacredness of wells, streams and water. Heads left in streams were an offering to the gods. The real head of Claudius was no longer available, so a symbolic head was offered instead. The first soldiers to react to the sack of Colchester were those of the 9th Legion, based near Peterborough. Its commander Petilius seems to have assumed the British were just an amorphous, murdering rabble. But they weren't. Their troops were brave warriors who knew the terrain better than their enemy. Boudica was ready for him. Part of her forces staged an ambush in the forests south of what's now Cambridge. The overconfident column of the 9th Legion fell into the trap. This was the sort of fighting at which the Britons excelled. They fought man to man, with the emphasis on individual prowess. The Romans were usually successful precisely because the individual was ignored in the carefully rehearsed system of group tactics. Here, in the boggy woods of Britain, taken by surprise, with no room to regroup and defend en masse, the Roman force was lost. Their short-stabbing swords and shields, so deadly in formation, were little match for the furious barbarian onslaught. This was a proper military victory. By defeating the 9th Legion, Boudica had succeeded in outmanoeuvring a battle-hardened unit and had killed 2,500 crack troops with little loss on her side. The British Celts had proved themselves superb guerrilla fighters. If only they'd taken the lesson to heart and continued a tactic of surprise attacks, they might have avoided eventual disaster. But for the moment, Boudica and her massive force were on a roll. There was nothing now between them and the next symbol of the hated Roman so-called civilization, London. In AD 60, London was newer than Milton Keynes is today. It certainly wasn't the main town in Roman Britain. First-century London was a purpose-built settlement sited at the high tidal point of the Thames. Goods from abroad were unloaded here and distributed round the whole fledgling colony. It was no Rome. 2,000 years ago, you'd have seen only wattle and daub buildings leading to a forum complete with market lying across the present-day Gracechurch Street, which cuts across Cornhill before it becomes Leadenhall. The business of its inhabitants, then as now, was business. These were the merchants and moneymen of the great Roman enterprise. There was money to be made in first-century London. But then messengers arrived from East Anglia with news of the disaster that had befallen the greatest town in the land. This time there was no complacency. As soon as Londoners realised that the avenging angel of Colchester was heading their way, their leader sprang into action. The procurator Catus Decianus, who'd helped cause the uprising by his outrageous graft, packed and headed off for the safer air of Gaul. There was no question that the fledgling city was going to be attacked. It wasn't if, but when. But then the first chink of weakness in Boudica's army began to show. From Colchester to London, it's 60-odd miles. Any of the crack Roman regiments could have made the march in 3 days. But Boudica's tribal caravanserai dawdled. Progress was so slow that before Boudica had even got close to London, Suetonius had left Anglesey, hot-footed it down Watling Street, and arrived in London with a small unit of cavalry. His assessment of the situation was bleak, brief, and workmanlike. It was clear that London couldn't be saved. His main forces were marching steadily southwards, but were nowhere near close enough to protect the city. So he gave the order to abandon it, despite the tears, prayers, and entreaties of the Romans who'd made a new life there, and the Britons who knew they'd be branded as collaborators. The only people not joining the line of refugees were the old, the infirm, and those who Tacitus says were attached to the place. Perhaps they were the first-century equivalents of the brave and stubborn East Enders who hunkered down throughout the Blitz, preferring to face the worst rather than leave home. Boudica's destruction was far more effective than Hitler's bombs. What the Luftwaffe failed to achieve in 6 months, Boudica did in a few days. It was Colchester all over again. Nevertheless, it's rather odd that more corpses haven't turned up. There are 2 possible explanations. The first is that once the revolt had been put down, the stunned Romans returned to try to rebuild their lives, and part of this process included disposing of the charred human remains with proper dignity. The second is that many of the victims weren't killed on the spot, but were taken off by the Britons to their sacred groves to be executed ritually. Although we don't have tangible proof of Celtic barbarity during the sack of London, Roman historians shocked their readers with hideous tales. One writer says that Boudica's followers took the noblest women, strung them up naked, then cut off their breasts and sewed them to their lips so it appeared as if the victims were eating their own flesh. Then they impaled them on sharp skewers which ran the entire length of their bodies. The histories say nothing about Boudica's role in these acts of torture, but perhaps the sexual injuries inflicted on the women of London weren't just casual humiliations of warfare, but symbolic acts of revenge for the sexual aggression suffered by the Iceni tribal chief and her daughters. But however shocking such activities may seem to present-day sensitivities, the Romans failed to see that their own culture was equally barbaric. For example, Julius Caesar was appalled by Celtic culture's adherence to human sacrifice, but nevertheless paid for 320 gladiators to kill each other at a games to celebrate his late father's memory. The Iceni campaign was in danger of stalling. Boudica's juggernaut started to follow Suetonius, but once again it was at a painfully slow speed, and with no apparent strategy. Tacitus notes that the Britons were far more interested in plunder and booty than in attacking hard targets such as forts and garrisons. They attacked the town of Verulamium, present-day St Albans, although archaeological evidence seems to indicate that by the time Boudica's forces arrived, the town had been largely evacuated. Suetonius had time to take the initiative that should have been Boudica's. Pulling together parts of the seasoned 20th Legion, the 14th Legion, and various local auxiliaries for cavalry, he assembled a fighting force of around 10,000 troops. The Roman forces were outnumbered, but Suetonius maximised his chances by engineering the sort of confrontation that would best suit his way of fighting: a pitched battle from a strong tactical position. We now jump to the final conflict. But we're faced with a monumental historical hurdle. None of the people writing the story mentions where it took place. So what information do we have? Tacitus simply says that Suetonius drew up his battle line in a defile, a narrow valley in hills, with a wood behind him for protection. He had his hardened troops in the middle, lighter-armed auxiliaries and cavalry on the flanks, facing the British, who swarmed and spread over the plain in front of him. It's not much to go on. In London, there's a long tradition, commemorated in names like Battle Bridge Road, that Boudica's last stand took place just north of the ruined city, and that the body of the defeated Boudica lies buried beneath platforms 9 and 10 of King's Cross Station. It would mean that having successfully moved from Colchester through London and on up Watling Street, she retreated to London again, effectively running away from Suetonius. It doesn't make sense. It would have gone against the warrior nature of the Celts to shy away from a confrontation with the Romans. Boudica's mistake wasn't caution, but being led into battle on Suetonius's terms. So King's Cross may be a dead end, but you can still catch a train from there to our most likely site for the final reckoning. The station at which to alight is Atherston, but the place you're heading for is Mancetter, or Manduesedum, literally the place of chariots. Mancetter was a base for the 14th Legion that formed the core of Suetonius's forces. Finds of armour and coinage that back this up have been made around Mancetter churchyard. The geography certainly fits with the description in the histories of Suetonius's chosen battleground. Mancetter church and village are on an open plain. The rail line and the river Anker both run hard by. This would have been where the British took up their position. In their confidence, they arranged their carts and other paraphernalia in a great semicircle behind their lines. Their children and ageing relatives would provide an audience as the Romans were finally taught a lesson. This makeshift auditorium was to prove fatal. Suetonius looked down on them from the hill. Behind the village to the southwest, the land rises steeply to a ridge marked by narrow valleys. There's still woodland along much of this ridge. Suetonius surveyed the heavy mass of painted and plaid-dressed warriors over the crests of his drilled and organised centurions. The British were screaming war cries while their druids hurled curses at the enemy. Tacitus records pre-battle speeches from both Boudica and Suetonius. There can't possibly have been a witness to any address Boudica made, but the lasting image of the Queen riding up and down her line in a chariot addressing the troops would have been clearly visible from the Roman position. The words Tacitus puts in her mouth are an emotional appeal to right the wrongs of Roman injustice. She ends with a call to freedom. You will win this battle or perish. That is what I, a woman, plan to do. Let the men live in slavery if they will. But Suetonius gave only a practical and bluff address that's got the ring of reported speech about it. In their ranks, there's more women than fighting men. Just keep in close order. Throw your javelins and then carry on. Use shield bosses to fell them, swords to kill them. Don't think of plunder. When you've won, you'll have everything. It was a tried and tested battle plan, and it worked. As the howling ranks of the Britons advanced, the Romans stood firm. As the defile narrowed, the British line had to contract. Their adversaries waited until they could see the whites of the British eyes. Then they struck. Each legionary was issued with 2 pili, javelins with long heavy heads tapering to an evil point. On the given command, 7,000 men unleashed both javelins in quick succession into the crush of unarmoured British bodies. The physical effect was devastating. The tribesmen were so densely packed that the Romans couldn't miss. Almost every one of the 14,000 spearheads would have killed, cut, or maimed. The psychological effect would have been equally staggering. The overconfident British advance faltered. Then the Romans set to work, years of training kicking in as the legions charged down the hill in wedge formation, breaking up the British line. This was butcher's work. As General Suetonius had said, don't bother to try and kill the bloke in front of you, just smash him in the face with your metal shield boss and let your mate, standing on your left, do the dirty work with his gladius, the razor-sharp stabbing sword that had won Rome the known world. Punch and stab, move over the bodies, and punch and stab again. This was the Roman killing machine at its most efficient. Even outnumbered 10-1, there was no contest. Hemmed in by their own superior numbers and moving steadily backwards, the British were helpless. They had no room to practice their agile skills with the sword, darting, thrusting, and parrying. Instead, the Iceni were herded like the horses they handled back home. As the bloody melee edged back down onto the flat ground, the Roman cavalry moved round to stop the British flanks regaining shape or means of escape. Inexorably, Boudica's thousands were pushed back over the river Anker and into the waiting semicircle of carts. Normally the Roman army didn't deal in mass slaughter, but Suetonius's men would have had hours before the battle to contemplate their fate if they lost. Now that their lives were assured, they could take revenge for their comrades in Colchester and London. The killing didn't stop with the soldiers. The watching women, children, elderly and infirm also fell to the encircling ring of swords. Not even the baggage animals were spared. Tacitus says that 80,000 Britons died. If the figure is correct, this was the greatest number of Britons to die in battle in a single day until the mechanised slaughter of the First World War. Roman casualties totalled 400 dead and the same number injured. But what happened to Boudica? Tacitus says she poisoned herself. Dio Cassius writes that she sickened and died and was buried with great honours. If she managed to escape the slaughter, this may be true, But both scenarios are much less plausible than another simple answer. Boudica was one of the pile of nameless corpses left after the Romans' bloodlust abated. Probably not even the British could tell which of their dead was the great tribal chief of the Iceni. Nevertheless, for centuries there's been intense competition to find her burial place. Most romantic is the notion that she was laid to rest at Stonehenge. Equally charming in a different way is to think of her lying underneath King's Cross Station, although Liverpool Street, with its regular service to East Anglia, might be more appropriate. Hampstead Heath, Parliament Hill and Waltham Abbey also have their supporters. And there's a promising mound in Quiddenham, in Boudica's homeland of Norfolk. But some archaeologists think that the quest itself is misplaced. Ancient British funeral rites seem to have involved excarnation. In other words, bodies were left outside for the air and the birds, until the flesh had disappeared, and then the bones were deposited elsewhere. Maybe there's no burial place to find. Some tribes carried on the fight, but it was a hopeless cause. Peace of a kind eventually broke out. The Romans saw to it that the boggy lands of the horse-loving Iceni were drained and used for more civilised agriculture. Meanwhile, the tribe slipped into the backwater of history. Could Boudica have succeeded in throwing out the Romans? Her revolt was not as widespread as the shocked Roman annalists might have us believe. The British tribes suffered from tribal rivalries that had been deeply embedded in their culture for hundreds of years. But success breeds success, and had Boudica caught Suetonius on the hop with a series of guerrilla raids, there's no doubt that she'd have picked up more support. If she'd won the battle, there's just the outside chance that Rome might have decided not to waste more money on the god-forsaken island on the edge of the world. And what of Boudica herself? Like the Iceni, her myth lay dormant. Her history was only preserved, ironically, in the writings of the enemy, fearful of the power of women. Not until the time of Elizabeth I did people begin to remember that another great British woman had once fought foreign invaders, and her place of history was assured in the Victorian age, when she became part of 19th century imperial myth. Boudica is the perfect example of the strange dichotomy that's grown up over the centuries about powerful women. The Romans' worst nightmare, a chaotic upturning of the social order. Later generations have underlined that fear by adding castrating scythes to her chariot. In order to approach such a woman, we've made her a caricature, not a living, breathing woman. She's almost a figure of fun, summoned whenever we want to pillory a threatening woman like Margaret Thatcher. But the desire to make Boudica something other than human is mistaken. There's no doubt she was charismatic, but even in the skewed Roman accounts, she never pretends to be anything more than the bruised and humiliated woman she was. She was simply the leader of an obscure tribe who was thrust into the international limelight. And yet she came close to defeating the most successful fighting machine the world has ever seen. 2,000 years later, we're perhaps the first generation who can begin to look at her achievements with an admiration that isn't tinged with hostility. But she's not the only victim of history's need to demonise and mythologise extraordinary women. Next, we meet Lady Macbeth. Shakespeare's given us one of the top villains of all time. Macbeth is up there with Dracula, Faust, Darth Vader and Hannibal Lecter. The only difference is that Macbeth was a real human being. He was King of the Scots from AD 1040 to 1057. This comes as a surprise to a lot of people, including many Scots. It's not easy to get a clear picture of the real Macbeth. There are only 7 references to him from his own time, and virtually no archaeological evidence. Shakespeare based his play on the historical chronicles of Raphael Holinshead, who was writing in 1577. Holinshead, in turn, used earlier medieval chronicles, and the story of Macbeth changed radically through this series of historical Chinese whispers. Nevertheless, Shakespeare's character is so imprinted on our brains that it's him we tend to see as the real Macbeth. One simple example makes clear how misguided this is. Shakespeare doesn't tell us what our Scottish king might have looked like, yet there are hundreds of actors who have played the Scottish king, and most of them have ended up looking much the same. They have a dark, brooding intensity, black hair, thunderous eyebrows, and sallow skin. But amazingly, in one of the few fragments from Macbeth's own time, we get a description of what he really looked like, and it paints a very different picture. The prophecy of Berchen isn't really a prophecy at all. It's an Irish poem that's actually a collection of works by different bards telling the story of various kings. The 3 stanzas about Macbeth are what's known as a praise poem. They start off by recounting stories from history, and then flatter the king with events that may well take place during the rest of his reign. Such poems were commissioned by great lords and were recited by bards at feasts. If the poem was recited while Macbeth was sitting in his great hall with his warriors, the bard obviously wouldn't have wanted to risk his neck by describing his paymaster in unflattering terms. Nevertheless, Macbeth is described as the furious red one and the red, tall, golden-haired one. In other words, he was a big chap with a ruddy complexion and flowing fair hair. The implication is also that this furious warrior was a man of action, not much given to introspection. In casting terms, we're looking at a character more like Gérard Depardieu than Laurence Olivier. Shakespeare's image of the nail-biting political assassin has sunk so deep into our mental landscape that it can be difficult to adjust to new evidence. Nevertheless, that's what we'll try to do. Shakespeare's play opens on a blasted heath. Mist swirls, lightning flashes, the place is a haunt of witches who cackle and chant. Into this spooky world come Macbeth and Banquo on their way to meet King Duncan. Macbeth has just covered himself in glory, defeating the King of Norway on behalf of his king. Suddenly 3 hideous hags appear and screech a prophecy at him. "All hail, Macbeth! Hail to thee, Thane of Glamis! All hail, Macbeth! Hail to thee, Thane of Cawdor! All hail, Macbeth! That shalt be king hereafter." Macbeth doesn't know what to make of it. He's already Thane of Glamis, but what about these other titles? Just as Banquo's advising him to beware of the prophecy as the work of the devil, a messenger arrives and tells Macbeth that the king has made him the Thane of Cawdor for his bravery, so the second part of the prophecy has come true. Does that mean that the last part might too? It starts to give Macbeth big ideas. Shakespeare unintentionally led people up the garden path by ascribing names and titles to people that make no sense. For instance, the real Macbeth was a lord, but he was never Thane of either Glamis or Cawdor. A Thane was a local minor bureaucrat administering an estate for the king. Macbeth was the Mormar of Moray, a much more important title. Mormars were earls of a province. They were part of a sort of extended royal family from which the king himself was chosen. 11th century Scotland was divided into several different Mormarships, but none was more powerful than that of Moray. So making Macbeth Thane of Cawdor was about as flattering as calling a cabinet minister a local councillor. But how did he arrive at his exalted position? Macbeth was the son of Finlay MacRory, the Mormar of Moray. His mother isn't mentioned in the earliest manuscripts, but it seems likely that she was a relative of Malcolm II, the King of the Scots. The modern district of Moray is a rough triangle, with the valley of the Findhorn to the west and the Spey to the east. It's the mountains, forests and rivers of this ancient area that would have been Macbeth's childhood haunts. Medieval Moray was much bigger. At one stage it stretched from the west coast of Scotland all the way to the east coast. The Mormar of Moray was in effect the ruler of a mini-kingdom north of the Mount, the Gaelic for the Grampian Mountains. In general, the kings of the Scots were happy to let the Mormars of Moray go their own way. He could call on them in times of crisis to come and fight. But most of all, he relied on them to be the northern buffer against the Orkney Vikings, who controlled much of Caithness as well as Shetland and Orkney. Being Mormar of Moray wasn't a job for the faint-hearted. In the lists written up by contemporary monks in which the Mormars appear, a sinister little phrase keeps cropping up at the end of their time in office. Ar suis occisus est. Killed by his own people. In 1020, Macbeth's father Finlay fell prey to this occupational hazard. Macbeth's cousins, Malcolm and Gilacomgain, assassinated him and assumed the Mormarship for themselves. Such cousin killings were the result of the Celtic system of inheritance. Instead of primogeniture, the Scots employed a sort of zigzag path through the family line, known as tanistry. Tanistry is essentially inheritance through nomination within the wider family. An aristocrat would nominate a tanais, a successor, usually a cousin, in the hope that when his own sons came to maturity, they would be eligible for titles in return. In the Celtic system's favour, it meant that in an age when strong leadership by an active warlord was essential, the succession was passed from adult to adult, rather than leaving infants in charge. It also avoided the infanticide that direct inheritance often generated. On the debit side, up-and-coming warriors with half a claim to a title got impatient and grabbed power by force rather than waiting their turn. Macbeth would have been in his early teens when his father was killed. His own claim to be Mormar was now a threat to the other candidates, so it seems that Macbeth fled Moray and was given shelter in the royal court of Malcolm II. Macbeth's life in exile would have been spent in acquiring the skills necessary for an aristocrat of the time. He would have been trained in fighting and weaponry. Andrew of Wintoun, writing in about 1420, describes Macbeth going hunting with greyhounds. He'd also have had an education in medieval Latin. While still in his mid-20s in 1032, the real Macbeth appears to have committed an act as bloodthirsty as the deeds of his theatrical counterpart. The chronicles report that Gilacomgain, one of the cousins responsible for killing Macbeth's father and who had become Mormar of Moray after his brother's death, was burnt to death along with 50 of his men. While the records don't name Macbeth as the guilty party, he was the beneficiary in two very obvious ways. He became Mormar of Moray, and he married Gilacomgain's widow, the Lady Gruach, the woman who was later turned by Shakespeare into Lady Macbeth. To a 21st century eye, this seems extremely strange. What would make a woman whose husband had just been roasted alive want to marry the man who ordered the killing? But Gruach was an 11th century woman. In those days, marriage was often a matter of political expediency. Gruach was of the royal bloodline herself. Her grandfather was Kenneth III, so her descendants had a claim to kingship too. What she needed was a husband who was going to protect her and give her offspring the chance of political success. The fact that Macbeth also adopted her son, Lulach, shows that there was an implicit deal to be struck. A marriage to Gruach was yet another reason for Macbeth to be named as the Tanais when the next King of Scots was selected. So, By the time Macbeth was in his mid-20s, the fair-haired young Turk had already seen his father slaughtered, had fled in fear of assassination, and had apparently killed a group of 50 warriors in his quest for power. In Shakespeare's play, we learn nothing about Macbeth's life before he made his bid for the throne. In comparison, we know a great deal about his young factual counterpart. Above all, the picture that emerges is of an age where violence and warfare aren't occasional events, but a constant fact of life. And it was the lesson learnt from this upbringing that Macbeth brought to his bid for the throne. After the battle, Shakespeare's Macbeth meets up with Duncan, the epitome of the gracious king. He congratulates Macbeth on his military success, but then reveals that he's going to make his own son Malcolm king after him, which, as far as Macbeth's ambitions are concerned, is a bit of a stumbling block. But he gets a horrifying window of opportunity when the king announces he's coming to stay with the new Thane of Cawdor and his wife. Egged on by Lady Macbeth, Macbeth slaughters Duncan in his bed. Duncan's sons, Malcolm and Donalbain, flee to England, and Macbeth immediately accuses them of being behind the murder. But Macduff and Banquo suspect that the finger of blame points at Macbeth, who's already sped off to Scone to be acclaimed king. The real Macbeth's early years have no parallel with Shakespeare's story, but we now get echoes of real history in the narrative. First, there's the battle, which immediately precedes the play's opening. Shakespeare portrays it as a great defeat for the King of Norway. In reality, the battle was rather different. By 1034, the King of Scots was Malcolm II's grandson, Duncan. Malcolm had nominated him in defiance of the Tanistric tradition, and this caused huge resentment. But Duncan had a more immediate problem: the Vikings. Macbeth was Duncan's right-hand man, leading the fight against the Viking leader, Thorfinn the Mighty. The resulting skirmishes and final battle echo the story of Shakespeare's Macbeth, but with one vital difference. The Orkneyinga saga, which records this episode, makes clear that the end result wasn't a victory, but a crushing defeat for the Scots, and in particular for their leader. And there's a big problem. The saga refers to the Scottish leader not as Macbeth, but by the mysterious name of Carl Hundason. The Orkneyinga saga is a collection of the oral traditions of the Viking bards, or skalds, who composed poems in praise of their lords. They tell the story of the great Viking earls, or jarls. The sagas dealing with Thorfinn were composed by Arnor Thordarson, who had Thorfinn as his patron, and he isn't too bothered about the accuracy of the peripheral characters, of which Carl is one. He names all the Scottish kings of the age except Duncan and Macbeth, so it seems probable that Carl is either Duncan or Macbeth or some sort of amalgam of the two. There are arguments in favour of either candidate. The writer states that Carl became king after Malcolm, and we know that it was Duncan who became king after Malcolm, so it would seem that Carl is Duncan. But then again, the saga confuses Finlay, Macbeth's father, with an earl called Hundi. This would make Hundi's son, i.e. Hundason, Macbeth. But if this is the case, why did Carl Hundason change his name to Macbeth? Later, I'll try to provide a plausible answer. For the moment, I'm going to assume that it was Macbeth who led the fight against Thorfinn. According to the saga, Thorfinn had stationed himself in Caithness with 5 longships, but then sailed back towards his headquarters in Orkney, just as Macbeth was sailing north with 11 ships of his own. The Scots took the Vikings by surprise and launched an attack, locking the ships together with grappling irons and swarming onto the decks in desperate hand-to-hand fighting. With odds of 2-1 against him, allowing for some heroic exaggeration, Thorfinn urged the Vikings on to a bloody victory. Macbeth himself escaped with his life, although his flagship was lost and he received a ducking in the icy North Sea. So while Shakespeare's anti-hero won the battle and was rewarded by the doting King Duncan, the real Macbeth seems likely to have been heavily defeated and almost drowned. But just as the Viking sagas portray the battle as bloody, we now come to one of the most horrific episodes in British literature, the subsequent murder of the king. End of Side 1. Side 2. Shakespeare portrays Duncan as a venerable and beloved ruler. His murder in Macbeth's own house is an affront to the natural order of things. The times are out of joint. But the historical facts were very different. Duncan was not a good king. In an age where military prowess was a prime requirement, Duncan was a bit of a duffer. In 1039, he launched an attack on Durham. Why Durham? The town was too far into Northumbrian territory to be a feasible point for extending the Scottish border. The attack was a disaster. His supply lines were too stretched, and the defenders put him to flight. His foot soldiers were slaughtered, and their heads collected for display on posts in the marketplace. This fiasco provided Macbeth with the perfect opportunity to revolt against him. In 1040, the unfortunate King Duncan was forced to head north into Moray. He never returned. The great Dr. Johnson and his pal Boswell, on their Scottish sightseeing tour, went to Inverness to see the castle where the play's dreadful act of regicide was committed, Boswell spouting Shakespearean quotes about the raven croaking in the battlements. But they were looking at a building of the wrong date. Even if Macbeth had owned a castle in Inverness, no trace remains of any 11th century one. But the central issue isn't the location of Macbeth's castle. More important is the question, where did the king's death actually take place? In fact, the real Macbeth didn't murder Duncan in his bed. This is a fiction created by Shakespeare. He killed him on the battlefield, just a couple of miles from Elgin. This comes from an almost contemporary source, the picturesquely named Maelbrechta the Hermit. Maelbrechta wrote a chronicle of world history used as a source by many later chroniclers. Maelbrechta states that Duncan was killed by his warlord Macbeth at a place called Bothgathnain, the hut of the blacksmith. And a later historian, John of Forden, adds that Duncan was mortally wounded in a skirmish, then carried to Elgin Cathedral to die. Shakespeare took a completely different story, the murder of King Duff in 966, and grafted it onto the saga of Macbeth and Duncan to add a bit of spice to the plot. Today, there's no sign of a blacksmith's bothy at the wayside. It needs a leap of the imagination to sense the violent clash of war bands, the fatal wounding, and the general slaughter of the foot soldiers that would have followed the defeat. The ruins of Elgin Cathedral are far more haunting than Inverness Castle, although also of a later date than Macbeth. But you do get a sense of the monastic complex that would have stood on the site. By carrying the wounded Duncan to Elgin, his men would have been taking him to the best medical help available, as well as getting him the last rites and the blessing of the church. After his death, Duncan would have been given the full honours owed to a Scottish monarch of the time. His body would have been transported overland to the west coast, thence across the sea to Iona, the burial place of the kings of the Scots and the lords of the Isles. So there was nothing clandestine about the killing of Duncan. Under the same system of tanistry which had given Macbeth the Mormarship of Moray, he was now within his rights to remove the king when his reign became shaky. To understand why the real Macbeth killed Duncan, it's important to remember that Duncan should never have been king at all. In the play, it's Duncan who nominates his son as king, thus thwarting Macbeth's ambitions. But in reality, it was the succession of Duncan himself that was the sticking point. While the defeated followers of Duncan were bearing his body westwards to Iona, Macbeth was rushing south. Killing the monarch was just the first step. He would only truly be king when the other Scottish nobles acclaimed him at the ancient stone of Scone, the place where medieval kings of Scots were made king. Scone Palace, a couple of miles northeast of Perth, was built in the early 19th century. 1,000 years ago, when Macbeth arrived, the buildings would have been predominantly of wood rather than stone. Nevertheless, it was one of the most important places in Scotland. We can create a picture of what Macbeth's inauguration would have looked like from later descriptions and paintings. There was no crowning. In Macbeth's time, the symbol of kingship was a sword with which to rule and protect his people. A bard would have recited the lineage of the kings of Scots from the time of Kenneth MacAlpine onwards. But the crucial element of the affair was for the candidate to be acclaimed while seated on the Stone of Destiny. The Coronation Stone of Scotland is a 336-pound block of Perthshire sandstone. Sitting on stone almost certainly had some sort of pre-Christian significance, associated with the idea of identifying the king with the landscape, connecting the ruler to the earth. This simple act was so important that when a king died, it sometimes led to a race between rival claimants to sit on it first. Moot Hill is a flat-topped rise just 2 metres high. The installing of the king took place on top of the hill, with the noblemen surrounding the area to declare their allegiance. Although Moot Hill may have been artificially created, there's no evidence to support the legend about how it was made. They say that each nobleman brought a bootful of earth from his own territory and swore allegiance to the new king literally on his own turf before adding the earth to an ever-growing pile. Thus Moot, or some say Boot Hill, was created. The Stone of Destiny is no longer at Scone. It's kept under lock and key in Edinburgh Castle, safe from thieves and the English, who forcefully borrowed it for over 700 years. It was only returned in 1996 as part of the move towards Scottish devolution. Scone was not only where kings were made, it was also where they ruled, which brings us on to the reign of King Macbeth. Shakespeare's Macbeth was king, but he wasn't secure. His friends knew too much. He had Banquo murdered, but Banquo's sons escaped. Next, he sent assassins to kill Macduff, but Macduff had left for England just in time. The assassins killed his wife and children anyway. No one was safe. The country fell apart, and so did Macbeth. At a banquet, he sees the bloody ghost of Banquo sitting accusingly in his chair. His nobles are treated to the sight of their brave new king gibbering like a lunatic. Macbeth returns to consult the witches. What he's looking for is reassurance, and they give it to him. They promise him that none of woman born shall harm Macbeth, and that he will never be vanquished until Birnam Wood moves to Dunsinane Hill to defeat him. It seems like a watertight guarantee. Meanwhile, Lady Macbeth is eaten up with guilt. She sleepwalks while trying to wash the stain of blood from her hands. Out, damn spot! Out, I say! The crime of Duncan's death consumes her mind, until she commits suicide off stage, unnoticed by Macbeth. The tyrannical rule of Shakespeare's Macbeth is mercifully short. In reality, Macbeth enjoyed a long reign and a prosperous one. He remained on the throne for 17 years. Indeed, he was confident enough, 10 years after becoming king, to leave Scotland unattended and visit the continent. The only hiccup occurred 5 years after he seized the throne. Straight after killing Duncan, Macbeth had tried to hunt down Duncan's 2 sons, Malcolm and Donald. The chronicler John of Fordham records that Donald sailed off to the Western Isles, and Malcolm went south to England, joining up with the Northumbrians, led by his uncle, Earl Siward. Strangely, for a brutal age, Macbeth didn't try to kill other potential sources of rebellion, and possibly the most significant comment in all the chronicles on Macbeth's reign is a line of Latin poetry inserted into the Chronicle of Melrose sometime in the early 13th century. It says, "Macbeth was King of Scots for 17 years, and in his reign there were fruitful seasons." This was the greatest accolade that could be given to a ruler. The prophecy of Birken also picks this up, describing Scotland as brimful of food from east to west during Macbeth's reign. This is the very opposite of Shakespeare's play. The times were not out of joint. There was peace, and people had enough to eat. Their two basic needs were being met. Of course, enough food in the bellies of the people of Scotland meant a diet largely based on oats flavoured with herbs. In contrast, Macbeth would have dined on roasted meats and drunk not only mead and ale, but wine. There's evidence of a healthy wine trade from Bordeaux to northern Scotland at the time, so Macbeth may have been a sophisticated connoisseur rather than an 8 pints of heavy man. Like Macbeth, the Lady Gruach has suffered from her portrayal in Shakespeare's play. We don't know much about her, but she's still one of the most famous women in this period of Scottish history. For a start, we know her name, and it's significant that she's not called Lady Macbeth. Most women in the early medieval period are depicted simply as adjuncts to their husbands, but Gruach is named as a queen in her own right. It may be that she encouraged her husband in his royal ambitions in the same way as Shakespeare's Lady Macbeth does, but the only evidence we have implies that Gruach may have been a godly and generous patron of the church. This reputation for piety also extended to Macbeth. In 1050, he went on a pilgrimage to Rome. In the 11th century, this was a big deal for a king. It involved not only the general hazards of travel, but it also meant leaving your kingdom open to external threat or internal rebellion. The fact that Macbeth went to Rome at all shows how confident he must have felt about the security of his position. We know about the pilgrimage through our old friend Mael Bricta, and his account says that the King of Scots, Macbeth, scattered silver like seed to the poor in Rome. A show of charity would be expected of a great man arriving in Rome. There were no coins in Macbeth's Scotland. The silver would have been cut-up pieces of silver plate. The fact that this giveaway gets reported to a hermit monk shows that as a publicity stunt, it worked. But this doesn't automatically mean that the king didn't have personal convictions. And there's just one more hint that Macbeth had an interest in religious faith: his name. In the 11th century, Macbeth, or Mac Beata in its Gaelic form, was still an unusual name in Scotland. What makes it striking is its meaning. The Mac means son of, but the Beata bit isn't a name at all. Mac Beata literally means son of life, a Christian name meaning a righteous man. So here we have a satisfying explanation of the Carl Henderson conundrum. Like Saul of Tarsus becoming Paul on his conversion, the devout Carl retitled himself Macbeth as a sign of religious devotion. From what we've seen, the character and reign of the 11th century king was vastly different from Shakespeare's character. Why? To answer that question, we have to travel south to Shakespeare's stamping ground, London. In 1603, James I of England, who was also James VI of Scotland, had become the bard's special patron. Shakespeare's company became known as the King's Men. It was essential for the players to think of ways to flatter their new employer and keep him sweet. Writing Macbeth gave Shakespeare the chance to do just that. The first show was given as a private performance in front of the king at Hampton Court in August 1606. Just 9 months previously, on the 5th of November 1605, London had been shaken by the Gunpowder Plot. It was this theme that Shakespeare so artfully exploited in ways that were particularly likely to appeal to James. First of all, the king believed that his family line was descended from Banquo. But Banquo was murdered by Macbeth, so by vilifying him, Shakespeare was blackening the name not only of a man who'd killed the rightful king, but also of someone who had murdered James's own ancestor. You can imagine a royal cheer going up at the moment in the play when Banquo's son Fleance escapes the assassins. It's going to be all right, Shakespeare's plot was saying. The Stuart succession is safe. James had two obsessions, the nature of kingship and witchcraft. He'd written treatises on both. In Macbeth, he was presented with a great drama that wrapped up these obsessions in a tidy bundle. Shakespeare portrays a venerable king, Duncan, who is overthrown, thanks to the intervention of the witches, and he paints the mayhem that follows. For aficionados, there's even language in the play that hints at the gunpowder plot itself, particularly references to undermining and fuses. Shakespeare's witches are such a powerful creation that the hubble, bubble, toil and trouble imagery of hags huddled over a cauldron is now part of popular culture. But there's a theory that the most famous scene of all, where the witches prepare their satanic brew, eye of newt and toe of frog, wool of bat and tongue of dog, is actually meant as a sly dig at the Scots. In England, the Scots were renowned for boiling their food and for combining unappetising ingredients. The cauldron wasn't a common symbol of witches before Shakespeare, so by creating this image, he may have been poking fun at Scottish cooking, having the three hags throw everything bar the kitchen sink into the pot. Back in the 11th century, the real Macbeth would have been at a loss to understand James's obsession with witches and witchcraft. Indeed, the official church position on witchcraft was far more tolerant than 500 years later. By Act 5, Shakespeare's play is reaching its climax. Duncan's son Malcolm has returned to Scotland with an English force led by Seward and the trusty Macduff. Shakespeare's tyrant is holed up, relying on the witch's promise that he won't lose till Birnam Wood comes to Dunsinane or be killed by anyone born of woman. What he doesn't know is that Malcolm has planned a surprise attack on Dunsinane using a primitive form of camouflage. His soldiers cut down saplings in Birnam Wood and create a moving canopy of trees. Macbeth's startled men report back to him that the wood is moving towards Dunsinane. One prophecy down, one to go. The attack begins. Macbeth's men are routed, but he fights on until he sees Macduff in the thick of battle. Macbeth shouts his defiance. "No one born of a woman's going to get me." Macduff says, "That's fine. I was born by caesarean section, not born of woman at all." But Macbeth doesn't give up. "Lay on, Macduff," he screams, "and damned be him that first cries, 'Hold, enough.'" And then he disappears off stage. We don't actually see him die, but Macduff returns with his head, and Malcolm goes off to Scone to be acclaimed king. In the early part of his reign, the real Macbeth wasn't sufficiently ruthless in getting rid of possible opposition. Now this mistake came back to haunt him. In 1054, Malcolm, who 14 years previously had escaped Macbeth's grasp, returned with his uncle, the Earl Seward of the Northumbrians, at the head of a large force in order to wrest back control of Scotland. The resulting battle was hard-fought and on an impressive scale. It took place on the 22nd of July, so it's called the Battle of Seven Sleepers, after the religious festival on which it happened. But it's only in the 15th century that the battle's located at Macbeth's stronghold, variously called Dunsin, or Dunsian, or Dunsinnan, Dunsinane of Shakespeare's tragedy. The man who records the event is Andrew of Wintoun. His original chronicle is a metrical saga written in rhyming couplets. And though he's writing so long after the event, his work's important because he had access to the Great Register of St Andrews, which is now lost. Wintoun preserves not only traditions antagonistic to Macbeth and similar to Shakespeare, but also earlier traditions, such as the prosperity and justice of Macbeth's reign. Even though the 2,000-year-old hill fort of Dunsinane, the last redoubt of one of literature's famous characters, is clearly visible today, there are no signs indicating its whereabouts, no souvenir shops or coffee bars, not even a Macbeth Discovery Centre. Archaeology on Dunsinane has been rudimentary. A straight, shallow, grassy trough across the top of the hill belongs to the most systematic exploration of the site in 1799. Astoundingly, modern archaeologists seem uninterested. Nevertheless, if Macbeth's southern power base was at low-lying Scone, Dunsinane would have been an ideal retreat in times of crisis. Macbeth and his nobles could have holed up there with the rest of their army camped further down the hill, waiting for Malcolm. The site's virtually impregnable to surprise attack. Which leads us to the business about Birnam Wood. Wintoun is also the first to record the tradition of a moving forest. He says that Malcolm sailed right up the Tay to Birnam, where he heard the mysterious rumour that Macbeth would be safe until the wood marched on Dunsinane. In response, he gets his men to cut down branches as a supernatural tactic of war. Shakespeare, on the other hand, sees Malcolm creating a great screen or shadow for his men to disguise their true numbers, unaware of the witch's predictions. Macbeth lost the Battle of the Seven Sleepers, but there was one significant name missing from the casualty list, his own. Despite the gory ending to Shakespeare's play, the truth is that Macbeth escaped to fight another day. There were now two kings. Malcolm controlled most of Scotland up to the Mouth, and Macbeth held on to his formidable power base in Moray. It was only a matter of time before Malcolm took that too. The end came 3 years later, in 1057. Malcolm was biding his time to make not just a decisive, but a symbolic attack. He made a fatal assault on Macbeth on the 16th of August, the Mass of St Mary. It was on precisely the same date that Macbeth had killed Duncan. The final battle took place at Lumfannon, near present-day Balmoral. After the skirmish, the last of Macbeth's followers dragged his body off the battlefield and buried it on a hillside overlooking the settlement. Macbeth's cairn has a bleak but peaceful air of melancholy, a rubble of reddish rocks covering the body of one of the most famous kings of Scots. Perhaps. There's another tradition. This says Macbeth's body was disinterred from the cairn and, like Duncan, carried to Iona to be accorded the full honours due to a great Celtic king. It does seem appropriate that he should have ended up at Iona. The Celtic shrine symbolises perfectly what Macbeth represented, the end of the line of the great Highland kings. And he paid the price when his history came to be written by supporters of the new regime. For them, he represented the ever-present threat from the north, the Gaelic-speaking people, who were different from the southern Scots, not only politically, but culturally too. If Macbeth's reputation suffered because he was the last great Celtic king of Scots, it is perhaps Scotland that was the great loser. The oath of loyalty sworn by Malcolm to Edward II of England, and the embracing of pan-European culture by the new political elite, soon came together to spell disaster for Scotland. So much can hinge on one life and one death. Out, out, brief candle. Life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage, and then is heard no more. Harold. We take our first forays south of the Thames with the story of King Harold. His homeland was the old Saxon kingdom of Wessex, comprising present-day Hampshire, Dorset and Sussex, and his life began and ended there. But his career took him much further afield, even across the Channel to Normandy, where his fate was decided by the man later known as William the Conqueror. After the death of Macbeth, there was a transformation of Scotland's culture and politics, but it happened gradually. In England, though, change occurred with the suddenness and violence of a tidal wave. And we can pinpoint the start of this change exactly. Go to the ruins of Battle Abbey in Sussex. There you'll find a large stone where the high altar once stood. The altar was deliberately placed to mark the spot where, towards dusk on the 14th of October 1066, an arrow fired randomly into the air by an unknown archer pierced the eye of King Harold II of England. Harold's death is one of the most vivid images that have come down to us, but in a way it's too vivid. It emphasises the received wisdom that all that's worth knowing about Harold is that he was the loser at the Battle of Hastings. But there's a hidden history of love, intrigue, violence, and cold hard cash. This is the real story of the last great Anglo-Saxon king. Around 1020, Harold was born into one of the most remarkable families in English history. He could never have dreamt that he would end up as king. The Anglo-Saxon royal line traced its roots back to King Alfred the Great and beyond. Harold's family were Johnny-come-latelys. Harold was the son of the great Earl Godwin, who one tradition says began life as a ceorl or churl, the lowest order of Anglo-Saxon freemen. But Godwin was a supreme political operator and carved out a sizable empire for himself in Wessex. He became something of a folk hero, famed for his cunning. Like a latter-day Odysseus, tales abounded of his wiliness. One apocryphal story describes how he wangled the manor of Bosham away from its previous owner, the Archbishop of Canterbury. One day Godwin and some of his men rushed up to the prelate, catching him unawares. "My lord," Godwin asked as though there'd been some mix-up, "do you give me Bosham?" "I give you Bosham?" exclaimed the Archbishop. Immediately Godwin and his carefully rehearsed stooges dropped to their knees and grovelled in thanks, making it impossible for the bemused reverend to withdraw the offer without losing face. Bosham, on the Sussex coast, is a good place to start the Harold Trail. Set inside the protective arms of a natural harbour, Bosham was the home base for the Godwins' private fleet. Today the sea lies at the end of the main street and laps the walls of picturesque cottages. Historians think that the church tower, although one story shorter than today, would have been used as a watchtower against Viking raids. The striking setting offers a view straight down Chichester Harbour to the Solent. Since the time of Alfred the Great, the Saxons had held off the Vikings. Then, at the beginning of the 11th century, the Vikings returned in force, the kingship falling to the great King Canute, or Canute. Godwin had been a staunch supporter of the Saxon monarchy throughout, and the Dane recognised his loyalty to his previous masters. In return, Godwin indicated his willingness to transfer his allegiance to the Viking regime by taking a Danish wife and giving his eldest sons Scandinavian names: Swegan or Sven, Harold and Tostig. Godwin swiftly became Canute's right-hand man, and for almost 20 years helped him control the English end of an empire. But when Canute died in 1035, Godwin, usually so astute, miscalculated by supporting the wrong contender for the throne. The expected successor was Canute's youngest son, Harthacnut. But when his father died, Harthacnut was far away in Denmark, and the throne was seized by another son, Harold Harefoot, who had the advantage of being in Winchester. So Godwin was desperate to find a way to prove his loyalty to the new and unexpected ruler, and consequently took part in a piece of political skullduggery. Canute's widow, Emma, had 2 Saxon sons by her previous husband, Ethelred the Unready. They were Edward, who would later become the Confessor, and Alfred, and they were both living in exile in Normandy. In the confusion following Cnut's death, they made a tentative bid for the throne. Edward sailed to Southampton, but he encountered strong opposition and retreated to the continent. At the same time, Alfred landed at Dover. Dover was part of Godwin's domain. To show his loyalty to the new regime, Godwin detained Alfred and handed him over to Harold Harefoot. Alfred was taken to Ely, where he was imprisoned, blinded and mutilated. He died there from his wounds. So if Edward, the surviving brother, ever came to the throne, Godwin would have a lot of explaining to do. 6 years later, his worst fears must have been realised. Edward was indeed made the English king. Godwin swore a solemn oath to clear himself of Alfred's death, and gave his new master a magnificent ship with a golden-winged dragon at the prow. Nevertheless, every time he saw the power broker from Wessex, Edward must have thought, "That man killed my brother." But the Confessor was a virtual stranger to his own country. He needed all the help the surviving Saxon earls could give him if he was going to control England. Grudges had to take second place to political expediency. Godwin was particularly vital to Edward's immediate interests, and along with Godwin came his sons. Harold was now 20 and ready to join the family firm. In about 1043, Edward made Harold Earl of East Anglia. He also gave earldoms to the oldest Godwin brother, Swegan. But the greatest family triumph was reserved for their sister, Edith, who in 1045 married the king. For Godwin, it was a political triumph. He was now father-in-law to the king. Harold seemed nicely set up. We can keep a track of his progress because in 11th century Britain, land was power, and deeds and documents that refer to his landholdings still exist today. An earl had responsibility for a large swathe of territory. Along with the office, there came ownership of several estates whose income paid for his private army. It also gave him the sort of lifestyle that became an earl. He would have been expected to entertain the king and his retinue on a regular basis, feasting them in his great hall. As Harold went about doing his duties, he gained more lands. As a new earl, he wanted to win the support of the locals by doing a favour here, spreading a little cash there, offering protection and justice to the people of East Anglia. In return, the landowners showed their gratitude by giving him a cut, donating pockets of land to add to his estates. It wasn't corruption, just the way things got done. When Harold moved on to his next post, he kept these lands and so built up his fortune. To make the young man's happiness complete, he was in love. The object of his affections was a beautiful young heiress from Norfolk, known variously in the chronicles as Edith the Rich, Edith the Fair, or most romantically, Edith Swanneck. Edith was a considerable landowner in her own right, and the affair blossomed into a passion that was to last until Harold died. Nonetheless, Edith was always an unofficial wife. Harold and she had what was known as a Danish marriage. In contrast to a Christian marriage blessed by the Church, a Danish marriage could easily be dissolved. As one of the highest-ranking earls in England, Harold knew that later in life he might have to make a political alliance. Harold Godwinson and Edith Swanneck were to have 6 children together. His life as Earl of East Anglia might have been an idyll of domestic bliss if it hadn't been for Harold's older brother, Swegan. Swegan is the archetypal aristocratic bad boy. In another age, we might have found him fighting bouncers in nightclubs or dealing Class A drugs. In the 11th century, when nobles also had a private army at their disposal, the problem child was much more of a problem. Trouble started in earnest in 1046. Swegan, whose earldom included Herefordshire, teamed up with Griffith, a prince from North Wales, and started raiding the kingdom of southern Wales. This was pretty much par for the course, but what happened as the troops returned triumphantly home was a series of actions that were considered barbarous even in such a violent age. The chronicles tell in shocked tones how Swegan abducted the Abbess of Leominster, raped her, and proceeded to keep her prisoner for a year. This outraged a society hardened to most displays of rape and pillage. It took the threat of excommunication to obtain the nun's release. Eventually, she was returned to her convent, and Swegan was sentenced to exile. Despite his father's pleadings, Edward was adamant that such behaviour couldn't be tolerated. Swegan took himself off to Denmark. But in 1049, predictably, Swegan was kicked out of Denmark. In Swegan's absence, Harold had been proving his worth to King Edward as a skilful naval commander by sailing with the fleet that protected England's southern coastline. He was indignant at his prodigal brother's return. When Swegan was exiled, his lands had been divided between Harold and his cousin Bjorn. Swegan's restoration meant that they'd have to surrender these lands. But for some reason, Bjorn agreed to speak to the king on the prodigal's behalf. He and Swegan returned to Bosom on horseback with just 3 attendants. It was a fatal move. As soon as he got back to his ships, Swegan took Bjorn hostage. It was a spectacular breach of trust, and it's hard to see how Swegan thought it would help his cause, but he set sail with Bjorn trussed up like a turkey. The affair ended with Swegan killing his cousin and dumping his body in an unmarked grave at Dartmouth. Once again, he'd gone much too far. Swegan was forced to flee to Flanders. Incredibly, Godwin was still putting pressure on King Edward to allow Swegan's return. In 1050, the campaign paid off. It caused all sorts of tensions. Edward began bringing in French and Norman allies to build up his power base and reduce his dependence on the Godwins. To make matters worse, Harold's sister Edith hadn't had a baby. Maybe she was barren, but later sources suggest that Edward chose to be celibate either for religious reasons or because he had a revulsion for sex. Nevertheless, if an 11th century queen didn't have children, it was her fault. With no royal offspring, and Godwin's reckless support for his no-good eldest son, Edward felt at last it was time to set up the man who'd been responsible for his brother's death. It was July 1051. Eustace of Boulogne, Edward's French brother-in-law, had popped over to England. After holding talks with Edward, he returned to join his ships in the heart of Earl Godwin's territory. On the outskirts of Dover, Eustace and his bodyguard put on their armour as though expecting trouble. Sure enough, in the inn where they stopped, a fight started. One of Eustace's bodyguard was killed. 20 locals and 19 of Eustace's men died in the resulting riot. Edward ordered Godwin to harry the people of Dover as a punishment. Godwin was faced with the choice of losing the loyalty of his own people or openly defying the king. He chose rebellion. In response, Edward called a royal council at Gloucester. At issue was not only Godwin's refusal to punish the people of Dover, but also the accusation of his complicity in the death of Alfred. Godwin and his sons were declared outlaws and given 5 days to leave. After 12 years, it seemed Edward had got revenge for his brother's death. King Edward hardly had time to celebrate when the Godwins struck back. The king had done the unthinkable. He'd removed one of the great barons from the English stage. The other earls now started thinking about the precariousness of their own position. The exiles' tentative overtures received favourable responses. In June 1052, the Godwin clan returned. Support for Edward was melting away. A truce was called, and the Godwins were reinstated. The king was forced into a humiliating climb-down. The Godwins' lands were restored, and Harold's sister returned to the royal marriage bed. As part of the rapprochement, Edward's policy of introducing French nobles and churchmen was halted. Many of those who'd come lately into the realm were unceremoniously booted out. The Norman Archbishop Robert of Jumieges took with him Wulfnoth and Harkon 2 young Godwin hostages to make sure that he got out of the country alive. The future looked rosy for Harold. He'd recovered from disaster with his reputation boosted. Within a year, 2 other events accelerated his rise to power. There'd been one significant exception to the Godwin amnesty. Bad boy Swegon hadn't been allowed back. One of the terms of the Godwin restoration was that Swegon should first make a pilgrimage of repentance. Never one to do things by halves, he'd set off barefoot for the Holy Land. He died of cold near Constantinople on the return journey. Before this news reached England, Godwin himself was dead. At 60, the wily politician succumbed to a stroke. King Edward named Godwin's successor. Harold Godwinson was to assume his father's title and lands. At 31, Harold was the most powerful earl in Britain. He was out from under the stigma of his troublesome brother and the burden of his father's awkward history with Edward. He could now establish his own reputation. Harold was the 11th century equivalent of a multi-millionaire. The map of England was a patchwork of territory that he owned. His estates underpinned a lavish lifestyle. This would have included great feasts and generous gifts for favourites. But his great passion was hunting, and specifically hawking. Hunting with hawks required great skill and patience. A peregrine falcon can fly faster than any other bird, and it was this noble creature that would have been a vital part of Harold's retinue as he moved from manor to manor. His interest was such that he had a library of books about hawking. But it wasn't all fun. A good proportion of Harold's income went on his official duties. In 1056, Edward was still childless, and Harold went on a mission as far as Germany to try and track down an atheling, a suitable heir, from a missing branch of Edward's family. Tacked on to this visit, he probably made a pilgrimage to Rome. He was a man of his age, and, like Macbeth, followed the standard customs for the devout aristocrat. Harold poured money into a major building project at the Abbey of Holy Cross at Waltham. His choice was a very personal one. The church contained a miracle-working crucifix. One chronicle records that Harold, who may, like his father, have been prone to strokes, had an episode of paralysis and was cured by a visit to Waltham and its marvellous cross. He not only paid for bricks and mortar, but ensured that the abbey acquired high religious status. On his European pilgrimage, he'd visited many religious centres and persuaded them to part with some of their highly prized religious relics, bits of the true cross, saints' bones and the like. When the abbey was finally dedicated, the service was conducted by the Archbishop of York, and the king, queen and leading nobility were all present. But this lavish spending would have counted for nothing among his peers if he hadn't been supremely skilled in defending the realm. For the first 10 years of his earldom, Harold built a great reputation as a warrior and politician, defending England not from the Vikings or the Normans, but from the Welsh. Wales then, like Afghanistan today, was a treacherous landscape unsuitable for heavily armoured troops. Instead, Harold decided on a brilliantly executed campaign to destroy Welsh resistance. He and his younger brother Tostig attacked on 2 fronts. While Tostig moved through the Welsh countryside, making lightning raids with light infantry forces, Harold commanded a fleet that struck at different points along the coast. The battle won, Harold opted for peace rather than crushing the Welsh, and decided to build a hunting lodge for himself at Port Skewett, now in the shadow of the M47 crossing. So by 1063 all was going well. And then Harold made the worst mistake of his life. Compared with the other heroes, Harold's life is richly documented, but from 1064 his history is told not only in chronicles, but by the first ever comic strip, the Bayeux Tapestry. It's an embroidery rather than a tapestry, and in spite of the faded colours, it still paints a vibrant picture. Commissioned by Bishop Odo of Bayeux from craftspeople working in Canterbury, It not only gives us the Norman version of the political story between 1064 and 1066, but also offers tantalising personal details that flesh out Harold's story. For example, it records the fact that in 1064 Harold set out on a trip to the continent. We get an idea of Harold's egalitarian nature as he gives his men a hand dragging the boat into the water, his bare legs seen through the shallows. He takes his hawks, so he's obviously going for some time. Why did he go? The version told by Norman chroniclers goes like this. While the Godwins were in exile, William of Normandy visited Edward, who promised him the throne of England. 13 years later, Edward sent Harold on a diplomatic mission to confirm William's position as his heir. There are reasons to doubt this. First, in 1051, William was tied up in a vicious struggle to establish his own position within Normandy. A foreign trip would have been a distraction. Second, it's clear that Edward didn't consider the question of succession settled. Harold himself was sent to Germany to bring back Edward the Atheling as the next king. And when this Atheling died, the Atheling's son, Edgar, became the chosen heir in his stead. Nevertheless, William certainly believed some sort of promise had been made to him. One answer is that the offer of the throne had been made to William not by King Edward, but by the Norman Archbishop of Canterbury, Robert of Jumièges, after he'd been forced to flee back to his homeland. Whatever the reason, it does seem clear that Harold had no idea what he was sailing into. Robert of Jumièges also seems to be the unwitting root cause of Harold's journey. In 1052, the jilted archbishop had left the country with Harold's nephew and his youngest brother as hostages. Rather than an official visit, Harold's quest was personal. He was bravely going to Normandy to negotiate the release of his relatives. Things went wrong almost from the start. Harold's ship veered off course, and he ended up north of Normandy. The Duke there took him prisoner, and was only persuaded to release him after threatening noises from William. Harold was out of the frying pan and straight into a blazing inferno. His Norman host was no doubt cordial, but Harold had no means of return to his homeland, and none was offered. Meanwhile, he had to travel round Normandy with William's court. The Bayeux tapestry emphasises the clash of the two cultures. Harold's portrayed as the typical Saxon warrior with flowing blonde hair. The Normans played roundheads to the Saxon cavaliers, having the hair shaved at the back. William invited his famous Saxon guest to accompany him on a lightning campaign against the Duke of Brittany. Harold couldn't refuse, and one notable event is remembered in the chronicles and the tapestry. The Normans were crossing a river near where it flows into the sea. Some of the knights started to founder in quicksand, and Harold rescued 2 men in full armour, dragging them to safety. Back in Normandy, William made Harold a knight. This may seem like an honour, but it was a two-edged sword. It implied William's feudal superiority and entailed an oath of allegiance from Harold. What followed was even more disastrous. William demanded that his guests swear a sacred oath on holy relics to support his host's claim to the English throne. Such an oath was taken extremely seriously. Breaking it could mean damnation. One of the criticisms of Harold in the chronicle commissioned by his sister is that he was too free with oaths. Whether this refers to this incident or is a general character trait isn't made clear. But whatever the circumstances, Harold would have known that he had a get-out clause. This was an oath taken under duress. Only when he'd done what William wanted would he be free to go. Once back home, Harold was left to ponder the implications of his Norman trip, until he was overtaken by an event that was to cause a seismic rupture within his family and contribute to his eventual downfall. After 10 years running the wildest of the English earldoms, Northumberland, his brother Tostig had fallen victim to a coup. He'd been responsible for 3 assassinations of local thanes, 2 of whom had come to his hall under a promise of safe passage. Even this injustice might have been overlooked if Tostig hadn't hit the Northumbrians where it hurt, in the purse. The problem was tax. In the 11th century, as now, people always thought they were paying too much of it. On the 3rd of October, thanes from Yorkshire with about 200 men stormed Tostig's stronghold. Tostig was outlawed, and the rebels asked for Morcar, the younger brother of the Earl of Mercia, to come and be Earl instead. Morcar was joined by his brother Edwin. They devastated the area, reaching as far south as Oxford. This was a serious threat to the stability of King Edward's realm. Harold was dispatched to deal with the rebellion. Harold was a consummate politician, but this was the most difficult negotiation of his career, the ultimate conflict between heart and head. Harold, knowing that William of Normandy was looking for an opportunity to assert his claim, would have realised the potential cost of civil war in England. Reluctantly, he recommended accepting the rebel demands and depriving Tostig of his earldom. Tostig was incensed and accused Harold of deliberately fomenting rebellion to get rid of him. It was such a serious accusation that Harold was forced to clear himself on solemn oath. Harold had always been close to Tostig, and losing him as an ally was a disaster. Tostig went into exile with a burning grudge against his brother. Christmas 1065, and the court of King Edward was crowded. The 28th of December was to be the long-awaited consecration of the Abbey Church at Westminster. But Edward never saw his pet project come to fruition. After carrying out his ceremonial duties on Christmas Day, he was taken ill and died on the 4th or 5th of January. A crisis was looming. With William threatening across the Channel, a child king was patently unsuitable. Harold, with his reputation for military prowess, was the obvious candidate. This must have been clear to the dying Edward, because on his deathbed he seems to have nominated Harold as his successor. The Bayeux tapestry shows the dying Edward pointing to Harold. On the 6th of January, the feast of the Epiphany, Harold Godwinson, the child of a thane made good, had become Harold II of England. For William, it was like losing his winning lottery ticket. He was told the bad news while out hunting. The Norman Chronicle of William of Jumierge describes how he took off for home without saying a word, and then sat with his cloak over his head. When the shock finally wore off, he called his nobles together for a council of war. In April, what we now know as Halley's Comet appeared in the night sky. To the people of the 11th century, it was an omen of doom. Harold assembled a fleet and stationed it on the Isle of Wight. He called up reservists from farms and estates across the country and positioned them along the south coast, scanning the seas towards Normandy. William's fleet was assembled at Dives-sur-Mer. Today it's a small fishing harbour with a marina for pleasure yachts. Yet it was in Dives 950 years ago that William embarked on the staggering logistics of assembling a fleet of 700 warships for an invasion of England. But when the fleet launched at the beginning of September, it met a northerly storm that prevented it from crossing. On the English side, Harold's forces also waited, and waited, then gave up. The normal fighting season was spring and summer. On the 8th of September, the reservists were dismissed to get on with the harvest. Then, just as Harold's forces had been disbanded, news came from the north. A great fleet had been sighted off the northeast coast. The wind that was keeping William penned in had brought a new threat scudding down from Scotland. Tostig was back for revenge, with 300 ships and the fearsome King of Norway, the Viking Harold Hardrada. King Harold had been looking the wrong way. After his careful preparations against the Normans, it looked likely he could lose the crown to an angry brother. He decided on a lightning strike. Heading north on horseback, he covered 25 miles a day. On his way, he got more bad news. Tostig and Hardrada had won a long, bloody battle against a force of Northumbrians. Harold would now have to take on the invaders without the aid of local troops. The Vikings moved on to York, took a few hostages, and moved out to the area around Stamford Bridge. Here they could feed their troops from King Harold's own estate at Catton. The English king completed the 190 miles from London to Tadcaster on the 24th of September. The next day he was able to march straight through York as the grateful citizens flung open the gates, and on to Stamford Bridge. Tostig and Hardrada suspected nothing. It was a fine day. There were between 4,000 and 5,000 men lolling around, awaiting the arrival of the extra hostages. Instead, they saw Harold and his army appearing out of a dust cloud. The chronicler Snorri Sturluson says that as they moved closer, their glittering weapons sparkled like a field of broken ice. Hardrada died early in the engagement from an arrow in the throat, but Tostig fought on bravely until he too was cut down. There are dark references in the chronicles to the biblical story of Cain, who killed his brother Abel, so it seems likely that it was Harold himself who struck the fatal blow. Stamford Bridge is a community totally dominated by that one battle. In Harold's day, it wasn't much more than a wooden bridge. Now it's a large village, mostly comprising modern housing estates, with names like Saxon's Way and Viking Drive. Even the public lavatories are decorated with a mural designed by local schoolchildren depicting the events of 1066. Stamford Bridge underlined Harold's strengths as a general. He'd won an extraordinary victory. Harold Hardrada's incursion was the last great Viking assault on Britain. In other circumstances, it might have been a victory whose significance ranked with Agincourt, Trafalgar, or the Battle of Britain. But the wind that had veered round to push the pitiful remains of Hardrada's great fleet back to Norway was stirring other sails. William finally sailed on the 27th of September 1066 and landed the next day at Pevensey. On the 29th of September, he ordered his men to march along the coast to Hillier Ground near Hastings, and they built a temporary castle there. Also on the 29th, tidings reached him of Harold's remarkable victory against Harold Hardrada. It wasn't good news. The last thing William wanted was to meet a conquering English force full of confidence as he edged his way towards London. It was probably this that caused William to dig in at Hastings. At the same time as a messenger was telling William of Harold's success in the north, another messenger was giving Harold the news of William's landing. Harold wasted no time in setting off south again. Pausing only to pray at the Holy Cross in his church at Waltham, he arrived in London on the 9th of October, where his second army was assembling. It was here that he slipped up. Harold had the option of waiting in London until he'd collected a massive and irresistible force of reservists. Why didn't he wait until he was invincible? Maybe he calculated that if he moved swiftly to stall William's progress, he could then call in his fleet to destroy the Norman ships, leaving him the easy task of wiping out a force with no means of retreat. Whatever was going through his mind, Harold ordered his army to set out for Sussex straight away. But if he was aiming for surprise, he was disappointed. William's scouts were well prepared. Consequently, it was Harold who was taken off guard. At about 5:30 on the morning of the 14th of October, William ordered his armoured troops forward on Harold's position. Which brings us to the Battle of Battle. The good burghers of Battle should sue Hastings Town Council. For 900 years, a town 6 miles away has insisted on giving its name to the most momentous event, possibly the only momentous event, in the town's history. In the 11th century, spilt blood had to be paid for with a religious gesture. So after his victory, William financed the building of Battle Abbey on the very spot where the battle took place. So while doubt hangs over the topography of many battles, a tour of Battle Abbey provides an absolutely clear idea of the layout of the Battle of Hastings. Harold had chosen his ground well. A wall 150 metres long marks the exact line of his shield wall. The hill on which it sits has been levelled to accommodate the abbey. But even with the reduction in height, you can look south down the steep ridge to the valley where the Normans had to attack and see what a formidable defensive position the Saxons held. They formed up in their traditional manner. Harold and his knights riding to the battle, then dismounting, so they could fight on foot like true warriors. Harold's shield wall would have been 5 or 6 men thick, with their fearsome war axes, protecting Harold, who stood behind them with his standard portraying a standing man laced with pure gold. Towards the fringes were the reservists, more lightly armoured, but a significant deterrent of shields, spears and axes to rain down on anyone struggling up towards them. William adopted the new style of warfare with a mixture of forces, infantry, cavalry and archers. An 11th century battle would normally last a couple of hours at most. In contrast, the Battle of Hastings was an epic that dragged on all day. Harold knew that if he could hang on until dusk, then he would have won. The story of the battle is detailed in various chronicles. One tells how the first blow was struck by a Norman juggler called Taillefer. He rode out in front of the English lines, taunting the enemy by throwing his sword high into the air. When an ill-disciplined Saxon rushed forward to attack, Taillefer lopped his head off, causing the Normans to surge forward with pride. At 9 o'clock, the battle opened with the blast of trumpets. As the Normans advanced up the hill, they heard the din of Saxons screaming and beating their shields with their weapons. And in the middle was Harold, with his battle cry, "Holy Cross." William's cavalry rode in and threw their spears. They fell onto Harold's shield wall like waves against a jetty. The Saxons didn't budge. It was the Normans who broke first. Word was that William had been killed. If Harold had followed up this sudden reverse with a concerted charge, he might have won the battle. But either he was content to wait, or he'd been distracted by the deaths of his 2 brothers, Gurth and Leofwine. In the melee of battle, William's horse had been killed, but a knight gave him another. William raised his helmet so that his troops could see he was alive. He then rallied them to a counterattack. This allowed William's cavalry to make the top of the hill and charge on the level rather than up a steep incline. But it wasn't the cavalry that won the day. The key to the battle is given by the embroiderers of Canterbury. At this point in the story, little archers start to appear in the bottom margin of the tapestry. In the dying light, William ordered his archers to change tactics. Rather than firing direct, they started shooting up in the air, their arrows then dropping and disrupting the shield wall. It was now that Harold was fatally wounded by that famous arrow. There's been some dispute about the figure in the tapestry clutching the arrow in his eye. Is it Harold? One account simply talks about an assault by mounted knights who cut Harold down and chopped off his leg and head. That fits well with the image to the right of the man being felled by the arrow, a mounted knight chopping at a Saxon's leg with his sword. But the tapestry is usually quite accurate about where it places embroidered names to identify leading characters. The word Harold straddles the figure clutching the arrow. It may be that this scene is the 11th century version of a film storyboard. First, Harold is accidentally wounded in the eye, and as he falls, he's cut to pieces. The falling figure doesn't appear to have an arrow in his eye, but amazingly, closer inspection of the linen of the tapestry reveals a straight line of tiny holes extending from the figure's helmet, where the arrow has come unstitched at some time over the centuries. With Harold dead and his standard fallen, it was all over. The English scattered, chased by the Normans into the darkness. The high altar of the church was positioned over the spot where King Harold II fell, a fitting tribute to the last Anglo-Saxon king. Tradition says that Harold's body was identified by his old love, Edith Swanneck, who recognised the corpse by certain marks on the body, moles perhaps, or some say love bites. His mother, Githa, preparing for exile, offered the weight of her son's body in gold for its return, but William refused. An enigmatic source in the Chronicles simply speaks of him being buried by the sea. Another chronicle records that Harold eventually came to rest in Waltham Abbey. And then, in the 20th century, a chance discovery threw up an alternative suggestion. The people of Bosham have always known there was a royal tomb in the church, but this was a child's tomb belonging to King Canut's daughter, who drowned in the nearby mill stream. Then, in 1954, during routine building work, an adult's tomb was discovered next to it. It was unmarked, but by its position could only have belonged to someone of royal status. It contained the partial remains of a mature adult male. There was no head, no right leg, and only half of the left. Moreover, the location in Bosham fits the story of Harold being buried anonymously by the sea. Harold achieved great things as a diplomat and a soldier. He put an end to the Viking threat that had been plaguing England for 300 years. He nearly won the Battle of Hastings. Without that arrow, he might have gone down in history as another Elizabeth I or Winston Churchill. Instead, the drips of cultural change that his father had so opposed became a flood. The new generation of Normans wiped out the existing ruling class and imposed a new and radically different culture and language. Historians have taken one side or the other, imagining the pros and cons of a Saxon victory at Hastings. But the transformation wrought by the Norman invasion was so complete that it's purposeless to play what if. English language and English identity are so rooted in a vibrant mixture of Norman and Anglo-Saxon that what would have happened if Harold lived must forever remain a mystery. William Wallace. If Macbeth's story gives us a guide to the Highlands, William Wallace provides a tour of central and lowland Scotland. Time has erased much of the past, but there are a few rare moments from long ago that remain as vivid as if they happened yesterday. For instance, we know exactly what the weather was like in Scotland on the night of the 19th of March, 1286. It was filthy. Sheets of rain lashed down. Wind buffeted the trees, and the visibility was awful. The reason we know this is because the storm provoked a tragedy that was to change the face of Scotland. And without that meteorological accident, we might never have heard of William Wallace. By rights, Wallace should never have come to our attention. He was a nobody from Renfrewshire, who only came to the fore because of what we now call the Wars of Scottish Independence. The best-known memorial to William Wallace is the movie Braveheart. It's a cracking film and contains nuggets of historical truth, but it's not a fail-safe guide. For a start, there's the title. Apologies for squashing the romance before we've even started, but Wallace was never actually called Braveheart until the movie. That was a name reserved for that other hero of Scotland, Robert the Bruce. After his death, Bruce's heart was preserved in a casket which was carried into battle at the front of the troops with the cry, "Forward, Braveheart." What knowledge we have about Wallace's early life comes from the pages of The Wallace, a great narrative poem by a minstrel called Blind Harry, writing in the 15th century. He claims that his account is based on a Latin manuscript by John Blair, Wallace's private chaplain, although this has never been found. We think that Wallace was born sometime around 1270, and the tradition is that his father was Sir Malcolm Wallace, a minor knight. But then a few years ago, a letter of Wallace's came to light in Germany with its original seal. It showed that Wallace's father was called Alan and wasn't a knight at all. In fact, this seal provides us with much vital evidence about Wallace, but more of that later. We're told that Wallace was educated in Dundee, and later by monks at Paisley Abbey. He would have been taught Latin, French, and possibly a little Gaelic. But his education would also have included a thorough grounding in the martial arts, skills that stood him in good stead in later years. But the Scotland Wallace grew up in was peaceful and prosperous. Above all, it was an independent nation ruled over by King Alexander III. Wallace was about 16 when high politics and chance overtook both him and Scotland. Alexander III had originally married an English princess, Margaret, sister of the new king Edward I. Before she died, she gave him a daughter and 2 sons. Both princes died without producing heirs. Alexander III's daughter, who'd been married off to a Norwegian prince, also died. But she left a baby princess, known as the Maid of Norway, as the only descendant of Alexander's line. In an attempt to rectify this weak position, Alexander remarried. His second wife was Joletta of Dreux, a French princess in her early 20s. And so back to the stormy night of the 19th of March, 1286. It was late in the evening, after a council in Edinburgh Castle and a riotous dinner, that Alexander made the snap decision to return home to his lovely young wife. Home was Kinghorn, on the other side of the Firth of Forth from Edinburgh. Even in a car with reasonable driving conditions, the journey takes a good 90 minutes. In the 13th century, it was a hard ride of several hours, and Alexander was much the worse for wear. His courtiers begged him to stop over. He was having none of it. Like many middle-aged men, he refused to admit weakness. He set off from Edinburgh and made the rough ferry crossing to Inverkeithing. There, accompanied by 3 squires and 2 local guides, Alexander set off along the coastal track to Kinghorn. Then things went disastrously wrong. In the pitch black of night, and with the wind raging, he became separated from his companions and lost his track. On the edge of the cliffs between Burntisland and Kinghorn, his horse must have reared or stumbled. He was found the next day at the foot of the cliffs, his neck broken. 6 centuries later, the Victorian Scots put up a monument to this accident on the main road to Kinghorn that runs along the top of the cliffs. Like many monuments, it's vaguely phallic in shape, and the Victorians were blissfully ignorant of the irony on the inscription, "Erected on the sexcentenary of his death. Never has libido proved more costly to a country's future." Looking out to sea, there's a smaller stone to the right of the monument with another inscription. It's one of the oldest poems in the Scots vernacular, a medieval comment on the wave of desolation that descended on Scotland at Alexander's death. "Saint Alexander, our king, was deed, that Scotland left in love and lee. Away was sons of ale and bread, of wine and wax, of gammon and glee. The gold was changed all in lead, the fruit failed on everilk tree." End of Side 2. Side 3. As with Macbeth, here's another echo of that ancient Scottish belief that good kingship ties into the prosperity of the land. Even the fruit on the trees withered after Alexander's death. Margaret, the Maid of Norway, was summoned back to Scotland to claim the throne and marry the 5-year-old son of Edward I of England. All the complex negotiations came to nothing. The Maid of Norway fell ill on the sea voyage and died shortly after her ship docked. The dynasty that traced its roots back to Malcolm II had ended. The Scottish throne was up for grabs. There were several candidates, but 2 in particular represented immensely powerful factions: John Balliol and Robert Bruce, an earlier relative of the man who was to restore Scottish independence in 1314. For any of the aristocracy to appoint the new king would imply that the arbitrator was superior to the crown. This was a job for a European royal. So the Scots looked to their nearest neighbour for help, the international statesman to the south, Edward I. It was the wrong decision. Edward I was certainly an impressive figure, but he was a dubious friend and an intimidating enemy. He was famed for his hair-trigger rages and was imposingly tall. When a group of scholars opened his tomb in Westminster Abbey in 1774, they measured the corpse at 6 feet 2. You can still see this tomb today. A Latin inscription tells you all you need to know about Edward's political ambitions. Hic est malleus Scotorum. Here lies the hammer of the Scots. When the Scottish nobles asked Edward to help them out, he must have seen the opportunity as heaven sent. It took 2 years to choose the new Scottish king. During that time, Edward undermined Scottish autonomy and carefully created a situation that had the seeds of failure already sown in it. The process began in 1291 at Norham-on-Tweed. He'd commanded the Scottish nobles to meet in the shadow of the castle. He'd also summoned his feudal forces and had warships stationed at the mouth of the Tweed. The Scots swiftly learnt Edward's price for acting as adjudicator. They would have to agree that he had the right to be overlord of Scotland. Nevertheless, prove it, came the diplomatic reply, causing a typical Edward explosion. The Scots asked for an adjournment. Edward could afford to wait. The Scottish lords were, after all, still part of the great ruling class who traced their roots back to French and Norman ancestors. They had estates in France, Scotland and England. If they refused to acknowledge Edward's overlordship, these lands could be forfeit. On the 2nd of June, 8 of the claimants, including Balliol and Bruce, acknowledged the English king as their Lord Superior. On the 11th of June, Edward ordered all the castles in Scotland to be handed over to him and Scottish officials to be replaced by English administrators. This was to be a temporary measure to prevent civil war. On the 17th of November 1292, court hearings culminated in Edward's judgment for John Balliol. On the 20th of November, John Balliol swore fealty to Edward at Norham. On the 30th of November, John Balliol was made king at Scone. The promised return of the castles happened more in name than in reality. Many of the English officials remained in place. However, Edward had misjudged the people of Scotland. He believed that if you subdued the nobility, the ordinary folk would follow. He was wrong. The scene was set for the emergence of a fierce young Scot called William Wallace. It was 1296 when the first blows were landed by the Scots. A Scottish army led by John Comyn entered Cumbria and looted and burnt farmsteads, churches and monasteries along the border. If the Scots thought such a demonstration would restore the status quo, they were mistaken. Edward was looking for an opportunity to teach the rebels a lesson. With Comyn's raiding party safely back over the border, it was the people of Scotland's economic hub, Berwick-on-Tweed, who provided the perfect opportunity. 5 weeks earlier, some English merchants had been murdered and their goods seized by the locals. Now Edward demanded restitution. His offer of mercy in exchange for an oath of loyalty was met with a barrage of obscenities from the city burghers. It's likely this show of defiance included baring their bottoms to the English king, an insult similar to that offered by Mel Gibson and his men in the movie. There was a weird belief among the Scots that the English had tails, and showing their bottoms was a taunt to the deformed enemy. Edward charged into the town on his steed Bayard, taking the defences at one leap. The flag of the dragon was raised, the signal for wholesale slaughter. Everywhere the soldiers killed, raped and looted. It said that the Tweed ran red with blood, and that Edward only stopped the carnage when he saw a woman being hacked to death by a soldier while in the very act of giving birth. Berwick never recovered from that blow. The massacre marked the first in a series of changes in its ownership over the next 100 years, until finally it fell permanently under English jurisdiction, although to this day its football team plays in the Scottish League. Edward moved on and trounced the Scottish army at Dunbar. He sacked the abbey at Scone, removed the Stone of Destiny, which he took south to Westminster, and stripped John Balliol of his kingship, literally. In a humiliating ritual, he ripped the royal insignia from Balliol's tabard. Edward thought he'd got rid of the problem of Scotland. He was wrong. Across the country, guerrilla acts of rebellion and riot kept the Scottish cause alive. And in the countryside of Ayrshire and Lanarkshire, tales started circulating about an outlaw called William Wallace. The traditional reason given for Wallace becoming embroiled in the maelstrom was a personal grudge. It's said that in an early clash with the occupying English, Wallace's own father was killed. This has been supported by mention of a Sir Malcolm Wallace being killed in 1291 at a skirmish called the Battle of Loudon. However, as we now know that Wallace's father was called Alan, we have to doubt this interpretation. And the same seal that tells us his father's real name gives us clues to Wallace's career path. On the reverse of the seal in the centre is the image of a bow. Far from being principally a broadswordsman, as seen in the Mel Gibson film, Wallace saw himself first and foremost as a bowman, probably as a bit of a poacher. Instead of going into the church, the landless nobleman took advantage of the general instability of the time and went off to live as an outlaw in the forests of Selkirk, making a living as best he could. But somewhere along the line, he switched from looking after himself to fighting for his country, and his conversion was due to the calculating cruelty of Edward I. A typical story has Wallace fishing, when suddenly 5 English soldiers turn up and demand his catch. Wallace says, "You must be joking," but offers them half anyway. Nevertheless, one of the English soldiers is so furious that a mere jock should give him cheek that he draws his sword and lunges at Wallace. The outlaw immediately parries with his fishing pole, snatches the man's sword and lops his head off. Then he kills 2 more soldiers before the others escape. The story, like many in Blind Harry's account, is apocryphal. Nevertheless, Wallace was obviously active before we get an incident which is confirmed by other sources. The first corroborated incident was the murder of William Heselrigg, Sheriff of Lanark. But according to tradition, it wasn't a political assassination, but a crime of passion. The story says that Wallace saw a maiden while at Mass in St Kentigern's Church in Lanark. She was Marian Braidfoot. The chronicles go on to tell how Wallace carried on a clandestine love affair and eventually married Marian. But the English appointee as sheriff at Lanark, William Heselrigg, also had his eye on Wallace's girl. He got his men to provoke Wallace into a skirmish, but before Heselrigg's men could arrest him, Marian helped him escape. In revenge, and full of lustful hate, as Harry puts it, Heselrigg had Marian killed. Hearing of the slaughter, Wallace returned to wreak his revenge. The attack was swift and terrible. Wallace went straight to the sheriff's quarters in the castle, surprising him in his bed. One blow of his enormous sword went straight through the sheriff's skull down to his collarbone. Then the Scottish raiders went on the rampage, killing the English at will. Wallace the outlaw had gradually changed into Wallace the scourge of the English. What was obviously important was the sense of power Wallace conveyed. Not only was he good at fighting, but he had the charisma to attract and command others. What lay behind this charisma was a single-mindedness, a devotion to a cause that turned him into one of those extraordinary people who do remarkable things through the force of their personality. While Wallace's campaign gained momentum in the south, his success was mirrored in the north. Compared with Wallace, Andrew Murray was a true aristocrat, a trouble-making Highlander of the old school, clearing out the English from their strongholds. When Wallace joined forces with Murray, the rebellion became a revolution. The English had to act. Edward I was away fighting in France. He ordered a formidable army north under the command of Earl Warrene and Bishop Hugh Cressingham to sort out the rebels. Wallace and Murray immediately marched to head off the English at Stirling. They decided to take the English on at the crossing point. Its name was to echo through history. Stirling Bridge was absolutely vital strategically. It controlled access to the Highlands. The Scots were heavily outnumbered, but Wallace and Murray had placed their lightly armoured foot soldiers on the high ground to the north side of the river, just to the east of where the university is today. The English, with their heavy force of mounted knights and professional infantry, were arrayed south of the river in the shadow of Stirling Castle. Between the two armies lay the river itself and an area of boggy ground. The bridge was narrow with no rails. The English made 2 false starts across the bridge and withdrew. But Hugh Cressingham, a warlike prelate who even English sources describe as fat and charmless, accused the cautious knights of wasting the king's money and told them to get over the bridge and mop up the rabble. Imagine the sight that greeted Wallace and Murray as they looked down and saw armed Englishmen queuing up to cross the narrow wooden bridge. They couldn't have believed their luck. For their part, the plumed knights must have thought that they would be given the usual courtesy of lining up nicely in battle order. That was the etiquette of chivalry. But Wallace and Murray weren't like that. They were 13th century street fighters, engaged in a last-ditch attempt to save their homeland. So they waited until just enough of the English had crossed the bridge, enough to fight and enough to kill. Then Wallace gave a single blast on his horn. The nimble Scots flooded down the hillside and cut off the bridge, preventing further soldiers from crossing. Then they set to work. It was less battle, more butchery. They slashed at the bellies and hamstrings of the horses, bringing them down into the mud. Then they dealt with the unseated riders. The English, deprived of space to operate, had no means of retaliation. Their costly armour was no protection as they foundered in the mire. Hugh Cressingham was one of the slain. When the Scots found the body, he was stripped and skinned. It's said that Wallace himself took a long strip of skin and had it tanned and turned into a sword belt. One of the few Scots casualties had been Andrew Murray, who died from his wounds. Most of the battlefield today is covered by housing. William Wallace High School playing field is the largest area of grass left. There's something spooky about the fact that beneath the feet of today's battling young rugby players lie the last remains of such a great carnage. Stirling Bridge helped to form Scottish pride, confidence and national identity. The fact that the vote for a devolved Scottish Parliament took place 700 years to the day after the battle has given it an added significance. But here's the cold water moment. Politically, it achieved nothing. There's even a good case for arguing that Wallace would have been better off losing the battle. The English, though they may have appeared to be a single threatening entity, were deeply divided. Then news came of the disaster at Stirling. An upstart, a robber, had caused the Earl Warrene's army to flee. The English chroniclers describe Wallace's rise as an attempt to turn a crow into a swan. Stirling Bridge focused everyone back on their patriotic duty. Wallace had united the English as well as the Scots. Wallace knew that Edward wouldn't take defeat lying down, so he took the fight to the enemy. He launched an invasion of the north of England. And in doing so, he confuses the heroic image we've had of him so far. Wallace's troops avoided the heavily defended garrisons and went for soft targets, farms, abbeys and monasteries such as Hexham and Lanercost. It was a campaign of systematic plunder, but it also went much further. Wallace's stated aim was to remove any English-speaking people from the border country. In an age when national pride was beginning to coalesce into something we'd recognise today, its natural concomitant, ethnic hatred, was also emerging. Wallace is accused of burning schools with children inside and of slaughtering women and the old. The onset of a harsh winter put paid to the Scots' plundering, and they retreated north. On his return, Wallace was knighted at Selkirk, possibly by Robert the Bruce. Then Sir William Wallace was made Guardian of Scotland. In the absence of the king, Wallace was now in supreme command. It's one of the interesting things about Wallace that he never sought power for his own sake. In all his dealings, he acknowledged King John Balliol as the true ruler of Scotland. Wallace now set about re-establishing political and economic order. The one artefact we have which gives us an unequivocal link to him reveals something of his policy. It's the letter that's now in a museum in Lübeck in Germany, whose seal tells us so much about his background. Wallace assured the mayors that it's business as usual now that the English have been kicked out. Wallace expected to be obeyed as he readied Scotland for Edward's backlash. Walter Bower's Scotichronicon describes how he had a gallows put up in every major town to encourage backsliders. But it wasn't the ordinary people who gave him the most to worry about. His prime concern was the nobility, with their shifting sense of loyalty. The great earls must have been as shocked as the English to find an outlaw in charge of their country. Wallace had already gone some way to countering the influence of the nobles within the army. Instead of organising the men according to their loyalty to a specific earl, he'd instituted a ruthlessly egalitarian system of command. Any disobedience at any level was punished by death. And having structured his army, he started to drill them in new techniques. Wallace invented a battlefield tactic called the schildtrom. The basic weapons of the Scots were spears and the dirk or knife. Wallace's schildtrom was essentially a hedgehog of spears, a circle of men in close formation with their weapons in a tight-packed mass impregnable to a charge from front and rear. The key to the formation was that the men should be able to move as one. Like the Roman shield wall with their deadly swords stabbing to the side, the schildtrom was a living organism, creating strength through organisation. Edward I made his way to York to take personal charge of the operation against that robber with a massive army. But such a large army needed feeding. Wallace decided to counter the invaders with a scorched earth policy. Towns and farms south of Edinburgh were fired and the population was shifted north. If the English were going to eat, it wouldn't be Scottish food. As the English moved north, scavenging for scraps in the devastated fields, they were harried by small detachments based in Scottish castles, but there was no sign of the enemy. When they reached Edinburgh, their situation became desperate. For Wallace, everything seemed to be going to plan. Then, not for the first or last time, the English were given a break through the treachery of the Scottish nobility. Just when they were beginning to lose hope, the Scottish lords Dunbar and Angus rode into camp with the news that Wallace's army was only 18 miles away, at Falkirk. Edward immediately ordered a forced march along the south bank of the Forth. By nightfall, the English had reached Linlithgow. During the night, there was a panic. Edward's warhorse trampled the sleeping king, breaking 2 ribs. Edward was in his 60s, but in spite of the pain, he mounted his horse and ordered his men to resume their march. It was now the 22nd of July. No one knows why Wallace abandoned his hit-and-run strategy in favour of a pitched confrontation. Perhaps he was caught on the hop by the forced march. Maybe he thought that the English were sufficiently weakened, that he had the ideal location and the tactics to beat them. As Edward continued towards Falkirk, his scouts reported a flash of metal on a hill overlooking the town. Edward ordered his army to halt, and the Mass of St. Mary Magdalene was celebrated. As the service came to an end, the early morning mist cleared to reveal the Scots preparing for battle on a hill below them. Wallace had arranged his men in 4 schildtrom formations along the hill. Between each of the 4 hedgehogs was a line of archers, and behind them his limited cavalry forces. As he saw the English squaring up, He shouted to his men, "I have brought you to the ring, now dance the best you can." The English hadn't eaten for a whole day. Edward wanted the last of the rations to be broken out so that his men could fight on a full stomach, but his nobles persuaded him to get up and at them. The Welsh infantry were ordered in first, but flatly refused to face the spears of the Scots before the English aristocrats had had a taste of iron, so the barons moved forwards. Wave after wave of English cavalry drove their horses across the boggy ground, up the slope, and on to the waiting Scottish spears. Again, Wallace's strategy for his outnumbered forces seemed to be working. But then two things happened that changed the course of the day and Wallace's future reputation. First, the Scottish nobility who formed the cavalry upped and left, and then Edward sent in his secret weapon, his longbowmen. Archers were nothing new, but this was the English longbow used in a totally new way. Massed archers firing so swiftly that each archer could have 3 arrows in the air at the same time. It was like turning a musket into a machine gun. The bowmen decimated the hedgehogs from a distance. The classic military response should have been a horseback charge, but Wallace no longer had his cavalry. What followed was carnage. Eventually the schiltrums had to break, and as they did, the English cavalry charged in to slaughter the retreating infantry. But why did the Scottish nobles leave the battlefield? Did they again want to strike a deal with Edward? It's tempting to see the whole thing in anachronistic class terms, but it has to be said that Wallace also survived the battle, deciding at some point to retreat rather than die on foot with the last man in the schiltrums. Was the defeat Wallace's fault? There's a school of thought that questions whether Wallace was a great military leader at all. They point to the fact that when he was with Andrew Murray, he won Stirling, and when Murray was dead, he lost Falkirk. But although the end was so devastating, according to the accepted strategy of the time, Wallace did everything right. He was simply overtaken by an advance in military technology. The casualty figures are put at 10,000 Scottish dead. Hardly any of those were buried. 2 of the few marked graves are in Falkirk graveyard, the graves of Sir John Graham and Sir John Stewart. They were 2 of the handful of barons who didn't desert Wallace. In Blind Harry's poem, it's Wallace himself who finds Graham's corpse on the battlefield and gives his tribute. "My dearest brother that I ever had, my only friend when I was hard bestead, my hope, my health, O man of honour great, my faithful aid, and strength in every strait." The defeat wasn't only political, but personal. Wallace had lost his men, he'd let Edward into Scotland again, and he'd lost his credibility. Not long after Falkirk, he either resigned or was quietly removed from the guardianship. A lesser man might have gone back home to lick his wounds, but Wallace was more committed than that. Our knowledge of Wallace during the period from 1298 to 1303 is fairly sketchy, but as Edward piled on the pressure, the Scottish nobility saw the wisdom of making at least a temporary peace with him. Not Wallace. He simply couldn't see why the essential rightness of his cause should be compromised. He plugged on with a small bunch of fellow desperadoes, travelling round his old haunts in constant fear of capture. As the Scottish nobles sued for peace, Edward made assistance in capturing Wallace the proof and price of loyalty. It must have been a terrifying time for Wallace, keeping one step ahead of the law within the great sweep of the lowland forests. Despite heavy cultivation and deforestation, there are many places where you can still get a sense of the forest at Selkirk. Perhaps the most romantic location is Legland Woods, the haunt not only of Wallace, but of his greatest fan, the poet Rabbie Burns. When he was a boy, Burns regularly made the 10-mile return pilgrimage to the woods, imagining the exploits of his hero. He later said that the story of Wallace poured a flood of Scottish prejudice into my veins, as will boil along until the floodgates are closed in eternal rest. The one thing he wanted to do above all was to write a song that would be worthy of Wallace, and he did so years later, composing Scots Wha Hae. There's one more Scottish site on our Wallace trail. Burns once wrote, "We are bought and sold for English gold." Rob Royston is the place where Wallace was betrayed to the English by his fellow Scots. The man Edward chose to close the trap was Sir John Menteith. Rob Royston is now on the very eastern fringes of Glasgow. The locals today are reputed to refer to it as Spam City, a place of burgeoning housing estates where aspiring couples survive on processed meat to pay the mortgage. In Wallace's day, it was all countryside. There would have been nothing here but the remote farmhouse where he stayed, known as Bishopriggs. On the night of the 5th of August, Wallace was sleeping with his mistress. Menteith had two conspirators, John Short, who'd wheedled his way into Wallace's camp, and Rob Ra. They surrounded the farm with a detachment of soldiers. After a brief skirmish, Wallace was put in chains. Then began the bruising journey south. When he got to London, Wallace was led on a horse to Westminster to be subjected to the travesty of a show trial. Westminster Hall is the most ancient part of Parliament. It's impressively daunting. Designed as one big high rectangle, there are no pillars to block the view, and for a time it was the largest freestanding building in Europe. The hall is now a busy thoroughfare for MPs, the ancient flagstones studded with plaques that remind you how much British history these few square yards has seen, most of it bloody and terrible. Thomas More stood here for his trial, Guy Fawkes there, King Charles just a few paces on. And then, as you get to the main staircase, at the top of the second flight of steps, there it is, the little sign that tells you that near this spot Sir William Wallace stood before the King's Bench. The last day on earth of our shadowy hero has been vividly recorded by eyewitnesses, including the chronicler Matthew of Westminster. This wasn't a trial as we would understand it. By way of a black joke, Wallace had been given a victor's laurels to wear, so to some, the whole scene had an echo of the trial of Christ. The English didn't see it like that. They had a job to do. There was no examination of evidence, no defence, no opportunity for Wallace to speak. The charges included homicide, sedition, robbery, arson, treason, and even when defeated, refusing to submit and come within the King's peace. Wallace stood silent throughout, except to interrupt at one point. He shouted that the other charges may have been true, but he couldn't have committed treason against Edward. Unlike other Scottish nobles, he'd never given a feudal oath of allegiance to anyone but King John Balliol. It made no difference. The sentence of treason had been decided before Wallace reached London. For his alleged crimes against person, church and king, Wallace was condemned to be hanged, drawn and quartered. Sentence was carried out immediately. He was stripped and tied to a wooden hurdle. This was then dragged behind two horses, while the crowds were out in force to administer their own rough justice. He was pelted with filth. Those who could reach would have got in a blow with a stick. The spot where the gibbet was set up is marked by a touching plaque on the north wall of St Bart's Hospital. It's to the south of Smithfield Market, where the square of West Smithfield, with its trees and circular car park, meets Little Britain. If you stand with your back to the plaque, you'll see the only building that would have been around at the time of Wallace's execution, the Church of St Bartholomew the Great. It's a beautiful building that was used as a picturesque set for 4 weddings and a funeral, and Shakespeare in Love. The show on the 23rd of August 1305 was another crowd pleaser. The dazed Wallace was brought to the gibbet. He's said to have made his confession and requested that a priest keep a psalter open in front of him while the executioner did his job. And that should have been that. The nobody had died a political failure. Edward's grip on Scotland was tighter than ever. But like many autocrats, the king had underestimated the power of a martyr to inspire. The relationship between Wallace, the idealist, and Robert Bruce, the pragmatic politician, has always fascinated observers. During his lifetime, we've seen the uneasy way the nobility dealt with Wallace's uncompromising quest for freedom, but it's said that his death inspired Bruce to go for broke. 7 months after the execution, he was crowned king. Edward I, the Hammer of Scots, survived Wallace by 2 years, and the fight was carried on by his less accomplished son, Edward II. On the 23rd of June 1314, Edward II was defeated by Robert the Bruce at the Battle of Bannockburn. Using the Schiltrom formation invented by Wallace, Bruce mimicked his success by trapping the English professionals in boggy ground near Stirling. And it's said his victory owed more to Wallace than that. Before the battle, Bruce made a passionate plea invoking the spirit of Wallace to inspire his men to fight for the freedom of Scotland. It was this speech that Burns immortalised in verse. Scots were hae wi' Wallace bled, Scots whom Bruce has often led, welcome to your gory bed, or to victory. Now's the day and now's the hour, see the front of battle lower, see approach proud Edward's power, chains and slavery. Lay the proud usurpers low, tyrants fall in every foe, liberties in every blow. Let us do or die. Robin Hood. Where shall we begin our quest for the real Robin Hood? In Sherwood Forest, of course. First of all, let's look at a tree. The 600-year-old major oak stands in its own clearing, its vast branches propped up by great metal crutches. Gazing through its branches, the imagination of even the most casual sightseer will be drawn into the past. Because this, as all the tourist guides tell you, is Robin Hood country. Legend tells us that the great outlaw used the major oak as a meeting place, and although logic says that it would have been no more than a gleam in an acorn's eye in the days of the merry men, romance is the stuff of the Robin legends. For half a millennium, children and adults alike have been brought up on tales of Robin's courage and audacity. The story has mutated through ballads, novels, radio, film and television. We've all grown up with our own Robin. For my generation it was Richard Green, playing out his adventures on a Sunday afternoon on the newly launched ITV. For my parents it was Errol Flynn. For my children, Kevin Costner. This hero, more than any other, presented me with a personal mission. Whereas many people leave Robin behind with childhood, the potency of the myth continued to fascinate me. I even made my own contribution to its evolution. In the 1990s, I wrote a children's television series called Maid Marian and Her Merry Men. Robin didn't come out of it too well. He was a wimpy underling. Marian was the brains of the operation. While researching the show, I realised the sheer weight of academic analysis that's been applied to the subject. The other characters we've investigated are solid flesh and blood people. However distorted, lost or besmirched by history, we can be confident that they have a tangible history somewhere just beyond our grasp. But Robin is an enigma. Who was the real Robin Hood? Did he ever really exist? If you look him up in Chambers' Biographical Dictionary, Robin has the distinction of being the only entry defined as a fictitious person. Would trying to find the real Robin Hood be as fruitless a task as attempting to track down the real Cinderella or the historical Superman? I didn't think so. The Robin legends are so grounded in historical context that I sensed there must be a historical figure behind them. In the story as it's generally known, Robin of Locksley is a dispossessed nobleman. Previously as the Earl of Huntingdon, he's a loyal servant of King Richard the Lionheart, but Richard goes off to fight in the Crusades, leaving his brother John in charge. Big mistake. John is a swine of the first water. He confiscates land, he fleeces the ordinary folk with swinging taxes, and lines his own pockets. Robin of Locksley is deprived of his estates. He seeks sanctuary in Sherwood Forest. There he gathers about him a band of like-minded outlaws. Together they rob the rich representatives of the unjust regime and, rather than profiting themselves, spread the proceeds round to the poor. There are certain key members of his merry men who are almost as legendary as Robin is. His right-hand man is a human giant ironically named Little John. Other members include Will Scarlet, Much the Miller's son, Alan a Dale, and a renegade monk, Friar Tuck. Looking for the real Robin will also bring us face to face with the Sheriff of Nottingham, King John's henchman. The sheriff has evil intentions towards Robin's girl, Maid Marian, and the tension between these two men is the driving force behind many tales of capture and rescue. The other main feature of the story is, of course, the absolute mastery of the longbow demonstrated by Robin and his chums. Even though they're wanted by the law, they show up at archery competitions in disguise and amaze everyone with their skill before narrowly escaping at the crucial moment. When Richard Coeur de Lion eventually returns from the Holy Land, he visits Sherwood Forest. Recognising Robin and his outlaw band as true and loyal servants, he forgives them their supposed crimes and restores Robin to his rightful position. But Robin still has a problem: Roger of Doncaster. This villain has an affair with the prioress at Kirklees Priory, who is Robin's cousin, and they plot to kill our hero. Robin becomes sick, goes to Kirklees for medicinal bleeding, and they murder him there. And that's where the story ends. Even telling it in this truncated form, it's clear that there isn't a single coherent narrative. The Robin Hood tales are like the edited highlights of the weekend's football, watched late at night. They stand out as a series of unforgettable, almost dreamlike episodes, but whether they're all from the same match, it's hard to tell. Our first job is to try and work out which story is likely to lead us to the real Robin. And as with the other historical figures, one rule holds true: the best source is the earliest. In other words, before we look for the facts, we must get to the original fiction. We'll start at the end of the 16th century. This was the age of Shakespeare, although at the time he was just another writer-producer trying to get more bums on seats than his rivals. And one of his principal competitors was a writer called Anthony Munday. In 1598, Munday stole a march on his rivals by producing a play based on the already popular Robin Hood stories. Why bother sitting through 4 hours about a Danish prince who can't decide whether or not to kill himself, when you could be watching all the thrills and spills of a real British hero? The downfall of Robert, Earl of Huntingdon, was a smash hit. Then, like all enterprising theatrical producers, Munday followed up his masterpiece with more of the same, the equally popular The Death of Robert, Earl of Huntingdon. Even if his titles weren't the catchiest, Munday knew his audience, and they loved Robert and his merry men. No, that isn't a mistake. Robin and Robert were interchangeable names at that time. But this was the first time that Robin Hood had been given the title Earl of Huntingdon. Munday had skillfully taken an existing folk hero and given him an aristocratic background in order to make him appeal not just to the groundlings, but to the folk in the posh seats too. Before Munday, our hero was just plain Robin Hood. His story was passed down in traditional rhymes and ballads. The earliest reference we have to these tales is from 1377 in the poem Piers Plowman. So if there was a historical Robin, he must have been around sometime before Piers Plowman was written. Ideally, then, we're looking for stories which are earlier than 1377. The only written versions we have, though, come from over a century later, but from the Chaucerian English used, it's pretty clear that these ballads are at least 100 years earlier. The oldest is called A Jest of Robin Hood. Jest is an old word for story. It's a poem of 456 verses and takes us as close as we can get to the original version of the story. But what does it tell us about the real Robin Hood? Lithe and listen, gentlemen, that be of free-born blood, I shall tell of a good yeoman, his name was Robin Hood. Robin was a proud outlaw. While he walked on ground, so courteous an outlaw as he was one, was never none found. Robin stood in Barnesdale, and leant him to a tree, and by him stood Little John, a good yeoman was he. The story opens in the greenwood, the outlaw's hideout in Barnesdale. Robin tells Little John, Will Scarlet, and Much the miller's son that he can't sit down to eat without company, and sends them out to bring him a dinner guest. The three henchmen apprehend a knight dressed in tatty clothes. They bring him back to camp, where he's given a slap-up meal. But, of course, there's no such thing as a free lunch, and after eating, Robin tells the knight that he's got to pay the bill. The knight apologises. His son has killed a man, and in order to pay the hefty fine, the knight's been forced to sell all his goods. Now he's only got 10 shillings in the world, and unless he pays £400 to the monks of St. Mary's Abbey in York, he'll lose all his lands. Robin lends him the money to pay the monks back. This loan is pledged against the Virgin Mary, to whom Robin's devoted. He sends the knight off with a new horse and a new set of clothes. Back in York, the monks at the Abbey of St. Mary's are rubbing their hands at the prospect of claiming the knight's property. The knight arrives just in the nick of time and astonishes them by emptying out £400 onto the table. But how can he pay Robin back? The answer is that he doesn't have to. In a reprise of the first part of the story, Robin sends his men to bring another guest to dine. This time they reel in a monk from, yes, you've guessed it, St. Mary's. This guest pleads poverty too, but unlike the truthful knight, he's lying. He's carrying £800. Robin takes the cash. The outlaws justify this theft by saying it's the work of the Virgin Mary, who's paying back the loan pledged in her name. So what does this part of the poem tell us about Robin and his world? First, that he's no dispossessed nobleman. Robin is a good yeoman. And in contrast to the monks of St. Mary's, Robin is a devout Christian. Nevertheless, first and foremost, he's a crook. But the single most important fact that the jest tells us about Robin is this. He's not from Sherwood Forest at all. Robin is a Yorkshireman. Suddenly, the major oak deep in the heart of Sherwood has become nothing more than an old tree. In the first stanzas of the poem, Robin sends Little John, Will Scarlet and Much the miller's son up to Sales to see if they can spot any travellers coming down Watling Street towards Barnesdale. This is a very specific geographical instruction. Our Robin was working in the area of South Yorkshire between Pontefract and Doncaster. Don't be confused by the words Watling Street. It's got nothing to do with Boudica's route. In the Middle Ages, Watling Street was a generic term for all old Roman highways, in this case the Great North Road. And Skelbrook, just a few miles down the A1 from Sales, boasts the first records of a place associated with the outlaw. For at least 4 centuries, Robin Hood's Well has been a tourist attraction. In the 18th century, the architect Vanbrugh designed a cover for it, an arched stone shelter about 3 metres high. Throughout the rest of Georgian Britain, savage punishments were being administered for highway robbery, but here, one of the top architects of the day was being commissioned to celebrate the most famous robber of all. Although, of course, by then, Robin had become a member of the gentry, and so was forgiven for his misdemeanours. This neoclassical relic looks a bit sad today. Moved from its original site to accommodate the building of a dual carriageway, it now sits at the southern end of a lay-by, dwarfed by HGVs and bypassed, literally and metaphorically, by modern progress. So what of Sherwood? In truth, Robin's connection with Nottinghamshire is tenuous to say the least. There's no record of place names associated with him near Sherwood Forest until 1700. But it's not just the lack of historical references that makes Sherwood a doubtful location for our hero. Sherwood Forest wasn't just a lot of trees. It was a vast area of mixed terrain, woodland, heath and scrubland interspersed with hamlets, used exclusively for hunting and hawking by the royal family of the day. It had its own force of specialist foresters employed to protect the land against poachers. Malefactors were hanged and left to rot as a deterrent. There was a prohibition on even entering the forest with a bow and sharpened arrows. Robin could have made the occasional foray there, but it would have been far too risky for him to have used it as a permanent base. But if the Sherwood connection is false, and Robin was really a Yorkshireman, what of his arch-enemy? Why was he confronted by the Sheriff of Nottingham and not the Sheriff of Leeds or Pontefract? In the jest, Robin and his men get involved in a feud with the evil Sheriff of Nottingham. It starts when Little John, who gets a job working for the sheriff as a steward, ends up having a fight with the cook and leaves in a huff when his dinner isn't served on time. By way of revenge, he leads his former boss into the clutches of Robin and the outlaws. Robin keeps the sheriff captive overnight and threatens to conscript him into their ranks. The sheriff tells Robin he'd rather be executed than live such a life. They set the sheriff free. In return, he promises not to bother them, but immediately goes back on his word. He tries to trap the gang by setting up an archery competition with a prize of a silver arrow. The band go in disguise, and of course the winner is Robin. What follows is the perfect narrative for a Hollywood screenplay. The outlaws are ambushed before they can leave the contest. They escape in the nick of time and seek sanctuary with Sir Richard by the Lee, the poor knights they originally hijacked and helped. Later, the sheriff gets his revenge by capturing the knight and keeping him prisoner. And who comes to the rescue? Of course, our plucky hero snatches the knight from the dungeons of Nottingham. When the sheriff comes in pursuit, there's a final showdown. Robin bent a full good bow, an arrow he drew at will. He hit so the proud sheriff, upon the ground he lay full still. And or he might up arise on his feet to stand, he smote off the sheriff's head with his bright brand. With the sheriff gone, the king arrives to try to deal with the lawlessness in the northern counties. He goes to the forest at Barnesdale and is duly captured by the band. Robin beheld our comely king wistly in the face, so did Sir Richard at the Lee, and knelt down in that place. And so did all the wild outlaws when they see them kneel. My lord, the King of England, now I know you well. But there's another surprise. The king isn't Richard the Lionheart. The monarch in the jest is Edward, our comely king. Robin Hood lived in the reign of a King Edward. Only 3 King Edwards are contenders, because the ballads in which Edward the comely king is mentioned were in circulation in 1377, and Edward IV didn't come to the throne till 1461. So we're left with our old friend Edward I, his son Edward II, or his grandson Edward III. And there's other evidence to support this dating. The early 14th century was one of the few times when the Sheriff of Nottingham was powerful enough to be responsible for affairs in Yorkshire. But the most glaringly obvious exhibit to back up this historical context is the thing Robin's most famous for, his longbow. Everyone knows Robin was a brilliant archer, but realistically this would only have been of symbolic importance in the early 14th century and after. During the reign of Edward I, the longbow rose to become the fearsome weapon for which the English were hated and feared throughout Europe. We've already seen how it was used to such deadly effect on the Scots at Falkirk. Soon, firing the longbow at targets became a competitive craze, like skateboarding or hula hoops. Villages vied with each other to produce the best longbowmen in the county. Before the 14th century, a great archer would have been little more than a yokel, but by the time of the first 3 King Edwards, he was the David Beckham of his day, the perfect cultural atmosphere to create a hero like Robin. So, which King Edward is most likely to have been our comely king. Only one seems to have made a tour of the north as described in the ballads. In 1323, Edward II made just such a trip in response to a political crisis. The aristocracy didn't like Edward II at all. By losing the Battle of Bannockburn, he managed to undo all the gains that Edward I had made in Scotland. This lack of military grit was compounded by the fact that he was gay, and through no fault of his own, there was a succession of failed harvests. So some of the nobles used the poverty of the people as a pious excuse to get rid of Edward. The aristocrat Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, made an alliance with Robert the Bruce. But with the same reliance on the longbowmen who decimated Wallace's forces, Edward made mincemeat of Thomas's troops. After the rout, Thomas was beheaded. His followers were outlawed and fled. Many of them sought refuge in the wild forests around Barnesdale. But a year later, Edward faced mounting discontent from other members of the nobility. He needed the support of the north. In an attempt to heal the wounds, he made a northern tour, which ended in Nottingham, during which he granted an amnesty to the Lancastrian rebels. So were Robin Hood and his men rebels leading a campaign against officialdom from the forests of Barnesdale in 1322? It's plausible. But do we know of any historical individual who matches this description? Lo and behold, in the court rolls for the Manor of Wakefield in the reign of Edward II, we find a tenant called Robert Hood living with his wife Matilda. He buys a piece of land in 1316, but the records show that he's lost it again by 1357. Was he now an outlaw? In 1317, the rolls note that he was fined 3 shillings for failing to turn up for military service against the Scots. But when he was summoned to fight for Thomas, Earl of Lancaster in 1322, there's no similar record of a fine to show he refused to fight again, so it looks like he went off to take part in the rebellion. Unfortunately, there's no background character or detail, so we don't know what happened to Robert Hood after the rebellion. Or maybe we do. In the jest, there's a coda to the tale. In what should be a happy ever after ending, Edward the comely king not only forgives Robin, but he also takes the reformed outlaw into his retinue as a valet, a personal bodyguard. But life at court is stifling for Robin the outdoor boy. "Alas then," said good Robin, "alas and well away. If I dwell longer with the king, sorrow will me slay." He begs the king to let him go back to the greenwood and returns home. And the records of the Exchequer register Robin Hood as one of 29 men earning 3d a day as a valet de la chambre in the service of King Edward from June 1323. Not only that, but in November the following year, this Robin is paid off with a gift of 5 shillings because he can no longer work. Could this Robin and Robert Hood of Wakefield be one and the same person? Now we come to the worst news of all. In the early ballads, there's no mention of Maid Marian. The jest is a tale about men being men, rough, tough, and not at all soppy. Marian comes into the stories later. When Robin becomes a nobleman in Anthony Munday's play, he needs a lady. And that's when Marian appears, and she's stayed with her man ever since. But even here there are strange parallels. Robert of Wakefield had a wife called Matilda. It seems likely that she too was outlawed and may have gone off to join her husband in the forest. In Anthony Munday's play, Robin's wife is called Matilda, but when they become forest outlaws, she changes her name to Marian. Marian may not appear in the jest, but there is one female character, and she's to be Robin's nemesis, the Prioress of Kirklees. She's taken a lover, and for some reason they plan Robin's murder. He goes to the priory for a therapeutic bloodletting, but the prioress draws enough blood to kill him. Little John arrives, but is too late to save his comrade. In later traditions, Robin takes his bow and fires one last arrow after asking John to bury him where it lands. Robin's death provides one last fascinating parallel between our prime suspect, Robert Hood of Wakefield, and the world of the early ballads. Research has established with a fair degree of certainty that the prioress at Kirklees in the mid-14th century was called Elizabeth de Stainton, and extraordinarily, it seems she was related by marriage to Robert Hood. Elizabeth de Stainton was Matilda's stepsister. As the evidence mounts, the whole story begins to have a compelling plausibility. The priory virtually disappeared during Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries, but overlooking the lumps in the ground that are all that remain is the derelict building where Robin is said to have been trapped by the prioress. An exterior flight of stone steps leads you to the room where our hero is supposed to have died. If you look out of the west-facing window, you can just see a line of trees on the ridge of a hill opposite. It's on this ridge that you can find Robin Hood's grave, a walled rectangle topped with wrought iron railing. Unfortunately, it's about 600 metres away, just over twice the maximum range for a longbowman in the peak of health. It seems to give the lie to Robin shooting an arrow and being buried where it landed. If he was on his last legs, you'd expect his grave to be just outside the window. But the grave exerts an extraordinary emotional pull. If you've been looking for the historical version of a great hero and someone says, "Here's his grave," it's hard to ignore, even if your head tells you that you're being sold a wrong 'un. Like the Vanbrugh cover for Robin Hood's Well, the grave has been shifted more than once. The original gravestone was first mentioned at Kirklees in an encyclopedia of 1607. It was sketched in 1665 by a man called Nathaniel Johnston. Later, this stone disappeared. A copy was made, but in the 19th century, a belief sprang up that chewing a piece of Robin's gravestone could cure toothache. In no time, the replacement stone was chipped away by superstitious canal workers building the nearby Huddersfield and Calder Navigation Canal. In many ways, the story of the grave is symbolic of the quest for Robin himself. Looking for the truth is like being the Sheriff of Nottingham. Just when you think you've got Robin in your clutches, he slips through your fingers. And that's true, too, of our Robert Hood of Wakefield. Just when we thought we'd nailed down the historical Robin to the period of the Lancastrian Revolt, new evidence emerges that challenges this assumption. I said this quest wouldn't be an easy one. There was a man from the little village of Fletching in Sussex. His name was Gilbert Robin Hood, and he lived in 1296. In the Middle Ages, you usually took your father's name, so a son of a Robin Hood might be called Robinson or Robertson or Hoodson, or even simply Hood. But the conjunction of two names in one surname is extremely rare. It seems to imply that the two names Robin and Hood already had a significance. This theory is backed up by earlier instances of this phenomenon. Robber Hods, or Robin Hoods, crop up in different parts of the country, and a surprising percentage of them have a criminal record. But the clincher is the case of William Lefebvre. William was summoned to the Court Assizes in Reading in 1261 for taking part in a robbery. He failed to show up and was branded an outlaw. The monk acting as clerk of the court wrote the miscreant's name simply as William Lefebvre. But the next year, 1262, we have a further reference to the very same case written by another scribe. In this record, William's name is written as William Robberhod Fugitivus. In other words, Robin Hood was a synonym for an outlaw at least 50 years before Robert Hood of Wakefield is first mentioned in any record. So where does that leave us? Is all the Wakefield evidence useless after all? Not at all. Robert Hood of Wakefield is the likeliest contender for the Robin Hood figure described in the ballads, but clearly he isn't the earliest Robin Hood. It now seems that the ballads were based on a real local hero, Robert Hood of Wakefield, who then had bolted onto him a tradition that was already in full flow. So we also have to look for another earlier candidate. And yet this is a curiously modern exercise. When the stories were composed, there was much less distinction between what we would call legends and factual history. So long as a tale had resonance and made a moral point, it was accepted as true. The point of retelling the past wasn't to discover an objective truth, but to give instruction for the present. But if we're looking to track down an earlier flesh and blood Robin, the most worrying parallels are with the history of Fulk Fitzwarine. Now long forgotten, Fitzwarine was once as well known a figure as Ronnie Biggs. He was the outlaw par excellence during the reign of King John. Stories sprang up about him when he went on the run after a dispute over an inheritance. Whittington Castle's picturesque ruins, fronted by a half-moat, half-village pond, lie in the centre of Whittington in Shropshire. In 1197, Fulk Fitzwarine's father died, and Fulk expected to inherit it. But there was another claim to the barony from someone who had better contacts with King John. Fitzwarine lost his claim, and in 1200 was outlawed. The earliest surviving version of his story was originally composed in the late 13th century, well before the Robin Hood ballads. It tells us that, like Robin, Fulk had a right-hand man called John, who entered the service of his master's enemy. Fulk's men accosted people and forced their victims to dine with them. Fulk captured King John in the forest, and finally the two were reconciled. So why should so much of Fulk's story end up in the tales of Robin Hood? There are several possible explanations. The first is that there was no historical Robin Hood after all. But why then does our fictional hero end up being called Robin Hood and not Fulk Fitzwarine? The second explanation is that there was a real person, like Robin Hood of Wakefield, who was made legendary by having a lot of other stories attached to him, including the ones about Fulk. But there's another possibility. It could be that both sets of stories spring from another hidden character, an even earlier Robin, who we haven't found yet. And lo and behold, there is another candidate from the reign of Richard the Lionheart. When Anthony Munday wrote his blockbusting plays, he was obviously tapping into some pre-existing tradition. We know such sources existed because some of our Scottish historian friends, Andrew of Wintoun, Walter Bower, and a 14th century Scot called John Major, no relation, write about Robin Hood and Little John as historical figures. Wintoun and Bower set Robin in the 13th century, but John Major puts him in 1193-4 during the regency of Prince John. One of the names attached to Robin is Robin of Locksley. Because the early Robin ballads were set in the north of England, it's been assumed that this meant Locksley in Yorkshire. But there's another Locksley in Warwickshire, near Stratford-upon-Avon, its manor house once owned by ancestors of Bishop Odo of Bayeux, who originally commissioned the Bayeux tapestry. Bishop Odo was a bishop of the age, more interested in power than the furthering of the Christian message. His conquests extended beyond his part in the invasion of England. He fathered several illegitimate children. The indication of illegitimate descent in those days was to add a Fitz to your family name. So Odo's English descendants were known as the Fitz-Odo family. It was they who came to own the manor of Locksley. Until 1196, the lord of the manor was Robert Fitz-Odo. How does this candidate fit with the story? Well, by 1196, Robert was no longer a knight. But he wasn't dead, although he seems to have been stripped of his title. In a reverse of the usual tale, in which Richard the Lionheart restores an outlaw's lands, it appears that this Robert, or Robin, was disinherited and declared an outlaw by Richard, and then restored by evil King John, when he came to the throne in 1199. The motive for King Richard's act of disinheritance seems to have been treason. We know that descendants of the Norman Bishop Odo fought on the side of the French king when he invaded Richard's territory of Normandy in 1193. If Robert Odo had sided with his relatives, it would explain why Richard later turfed him out. King John, on the other hand, was on the French king's side. Could this Robert Odo be the man that John Major's referring to as the original Robin Hood? In Loxley Churchyard, there's evidence that this theory needs to be taken seriously. A gravestone that bears an uncanny resemblance to the sketch of Robin Hood's grave by Nathaniel Johnston. We know that the original Kirklees gravestone disappeared. Why should it end up here? Maybe it's just a coincidence. There are only a limited number of designs on gravestones, but the design on the original Robin Hood grave is quite distinctive. Or perhaps this gravestone is a copy of the Nathaniel Johnston drawing, a tribute to Robin Hood by someone who wanted to tie their own Warwickshire Loxley into the legend. But the confusion over these pieces of stone doesn't remove the possibility that Robert Fitz-Odo is the most likely contender for the early tradition of Robin as a nobleman, which was then taken up by Anthony Munday and later universally accepted. Our patchwork of sources is at last beginning to come together. The jest is clearly influenced by the events surrounding the Lancastrian revolt, and we can be pretty confident that the flesh and blood Robert Hood of Wakefield was a major source for the Robin stories. We've also discovered other renegades and rebels whose names and stories became wound into the tradition, along with characters like William Lefebvre, who became Robin Hoods by virtue, if that's the right word, of their criminality. For those who like their Robin aristocratic, we have a candidate in Robert Odo. But what gave Robin the legendary status to outlast all his other contemporaries? To answer this, we must return to Sherwood Forest, not to any of the traditional Robin sites, but to Southwell Minster, a superb example of medieval architecture. The stonemasons left a magnificent flourish behind them in the octagonal chapter house. It's phenomenally hard to carve lifelike leaves in a medium as solid as stone. The accepted medieval convention was to use a stylized shorthand, a stubby three-pointed representative symbol. But here, the masons have covered every available corbel, niche and crevice with a forest of delicately wrought realism. There are oak shoots complete with acorns, beech and sycamore. Ivy stems writhe and intertwine, and wound into this intricate design are strange faces peering through the foliage, some with roots and stems sprouting from their gaping mouths. These are known as foliate heads. They are, in this bastion of Christianity, representations of the ancient pagan nature spirit, the Green Man. Another name for this ancient puckish figure was Robin Goodfellow, otherwise known as Robin of the Wood or Robin in the Hood. And this Robin, too, has played his part in forming our image of Robin Hood. He's got nothing to do with outlawry, but he helps to account for the magic of the Robin stories. Robin's always framed by the forest. He makes forays into the town, he goes into the king's service, but he's drawn back to the green wood. If these stone faces poking out from the frozen greenery of the chapter house are at last images of the original Robin, they're appropriately paradoxical, real representations of a made-up figure, solid yet insubstantial, mythic but cheekily human. After visiting all the sites and weighing up the evidence, it's these pagan mischief-makers hiding out under the very noses of the Christian authorities at Southwell who may well be the closest we can get to a Robin from the Middle Ages. And it's their spirit which, despite countless changes, is still central to the Robin legend today. Part of Robin's appeal is that he's infinitely malleable. Robin will become the hero that the next generation needs and wants to hear about, because he is both fact and fiction. His continuing appeal relies on the fact that he isn't earthbound by one brief historical lifetime. And because the resulting Robin was a mix of both the legendary and the historical, he was peculiarly satisfying and convincing to his audience, brave and kind, fair and tough, and just human enough to convince us that, in a better world, we too could be Robin Hood. This has been a journey into history to retrace the true story of 5 British people who in one way or another epitomised the clash between the old and the new, the native and the alien. It's also, by extension, about the myths those characters have woven into the nation's story and character. These great figures are part of the baggage we carry with us into the future. What I hope I've done is blow away just a little of the mists of time to reveal the flesh and blood characters behind some of the ghosts that haunt every corner of our country and our culture.